The bullet tore through the saloon window just as Ethan Rourke raised his whiskey glass. 3 years of blood, sweat, and cattle drives, all his savings, now worthless paper in his pocket. The drunk across the bar was already drawing his gun, and Ethan knew this fight would cost him everything. But what he didn't know yet was that the man he was about to kill would drag him into a conspiracy so dark it could drown the entire frontier in blood. This is the story of one man's desperate race to stop an assassination that would change history. Stay with me until the end, hit that like button, and comment what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this tale travels across the world. The frontier dust had a way of getting into everything: your boots, your lungs, your soul. After 3 years pushing cattle through hell itself, Ethan Rourke had enough dust in him to bury a man twice over. He sat alone at a corner table in the Red Canyon Saloon, watching the amber liquid in his glass catch the fading afternoon light filtering through grimy windows. Outside, the town of Redemption Creek sprawled across the borderlands like a drunk who'd fallen and couldn't quite get back up. False-fronted buildings lined a wide dirt street churned into powder by countless hooves and wagon wheels. The war had passed through here once, leaving scars that never quite healed. Bullet holes in the general store's sign, a burned-out livery at the edge of town, and men with missing limbs who sat on porches with empty eyes. Ethan pulled the folded bills from his vest pocket for the 100th time that day. 3 years' wages. Money earned through sun that scorched your neck raw, rain that froze you to the bone, and stampedes that killed men in seconds. He'd counted every dollar 1,000 times on the trail, planning exactly what he'd buy. A small spread of good land, maybe 50 head of cattle to start, a cabin with real glass windows. Now the money was worthless. The war had done something to the currency. Nobody quite understood the economics of it, but the Confederate script he'd been paid in had collapsed overnight. Shopkeepers laughed when you tried to spend it. The banker had actually thrown him out of the office that morning, telling him those bills were good for nothing but starting fires. "Hey, Cowboy," the voice slurred from across the room. "You deaf or just stupid?" Ethan didn't look up. He'd learned long ago that eye contact was often the match that lit the fuse. He took a slow sip of whiskey, his last affordable luxury, bought with the few Union coins he'd scrounged from odd jobs that morning. "I'm talking to you, trail trash." The saloon went quiet in that particular way that meant trouble was coming. The piano player's hands stilled on the keys. The bartender, a thick-armed man named Carson, stepped back from the bar, his eyes darting toward the door like he was calculating his exit. Ethan finally looked up. The man swaying in the center of the room was maybe 25, with the kind of face that wore anger like a second skin. His clothes marked him as local gentry: clean shirt, embroidered vest, boots without trail dust. But his eyes were wrong, swimming with whiskey and something meaner underneath. "James," Carson said carefully, "maybe you want to take that bottle and head on home. Your brother wouldn't want—" "Don't you tell me what my brother would want!" James's hand hovered near the revolver at his hip. "This drifter's been sitting here for an hour, drinking on credit probably, and nobody says a word. But when I want to have a conversation, suddenly everyone's nervous." "I paid for my drink," Ethan said quietly. He set the glass down with deliberate care. "And I'm not looking for trouble." "Well, trouble found you anyway, didn't it?" James took 3 unsteady steps forward. "You know what I think? I think you're one of them Confederate sympathizers. I think that worthless paper in your pocket says everything about what kind of man you are." Ethan felt his jaw tighten. The war's over. "Not for everyone." James's voice dropped to something cold and sharp. "Not for the men who died. Not for the families torn apart. And not for drifters who rode for the wrong side. I didn't ride for anyone." Ethan stood slowly, keeping his hands visible. "I drove cattle, that's all. Now I'm just trying to find honest work and move on." "Move on?" James laughed, but there was no humor in it. "This is my town. My brother's the sheriff here. We decide who moves on and who stays." The late afternoon sun slanted through the window, illuminating the dust motes that hung in the air like suspended time. Ethan could see it all playing out already. The young fool's hand would twitch toward his gun, forcing a choice that would change everything. "Your brother sounds like a reasonable man," Ethan said, trying one last time. "Why don't we go talk to him together? I'll explain—" I'm just passing through. My brother's reasonable. I'm not. James's hand moved. It wasn't fast. Drink had slowed him down, made him sloppy, but it was deliberate. His fingers wrapped around the grip of his Colt, and in that moment, Ethan stopped being a man trying to avoid trouble and became what 3 years on the trail had made him, a survivor. Ethan's own gun cleared leather in a single fluid motion. The sound of the shot was deafening in the enclosed space, a thunderclap that made everyone flinch. James's gun had barely cleared his holster before he stumbled backward, a red flower blooming across his chest. The young man looked down at the spreading crimson with something like surprise. His gun clattered to the floor. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but only blood came out. Then his knees buckled, and he collapsed into a heap of expensive clothes and wasted life. The silence that followed was worse than the gunshot. Ethan stood frozen, his smoking revolver still extended, watching a man die because he'd been too drunk and too angry to walk away. It wasn't the first time Ethan had killed. The trail taught you to shoot rustlers and predators, both animal and human, but it never got easier. Each death carved something out of you that never grew back. "Sweet Jesus," Carson whispered. "That's James Holloway, the sheriff's little brother." The words hit Ethan like a physical blow. Of course it was. Of course the drunk fool who'd forced this fight was connected to the law. That's how the frontier worked. Luck was just another way the world kicked you when you were down. "It was self-defense," one of the other patrons said, but his voice wavered. "We all saw him draw first." "Doesn't matter," another man muttered. "Sheriff Holloway ain't gonna see it that way. He's gonna see his baby brother dead on the floor." Ethan holstered his weapon with hands that had started to shake, not from fear, but from the adrenaline that always came after. He'd been in Redemption Creek for less than 8 hours, and he'd already become the thing every drifter feared most, a wanted man in a town where he had no friends and no leverage. "Someone should fetch the sheriff," Carson said, though nobody moved. They all knew what was coming, the rage, the accusations, the impossible situation of being right in a world where being right didn't matter if you didn't have power. Ethan looked down at James Holloway's body, at the blood pooling beneath him in the sawdust, at the life draining away because of pride and whiskey and bad choices. 3 years of hard work, all his dreams of a fresh start, and it came down to this: another dead man, another reason to run. "I'll turn myself in," Ethan said. "It was a fair fight. The law in this town is Sheriff Holloway," Carson interrupted, "and you just killed his only living family. Fair don't enter into it." Through the window, Ethan could see people gathering in the street, drawn by the gunshot. Word would spread fast. In minutes, the whole town would know. In an hour, Sheriff Holloway would be looking for vengeance disguised as justice. Ethan pushed through the saloon doors into the dying light of late afternoon. The crowd parted around him like he carried plague. Their faces showed everything he needed to know: fear, anger, judgment. Nobody spoke, but their silence was louder than any accusation. He headed for the livery stable where he'd boarded his horse that morning. If he was going to run, he needed to do it now, before the sheriff organized a posse. But running meant confirming his guilt in everyone's eyes, meant being hunted across the frontier like an animal. The alternative was staying and facing a trial that would be rigged against him from the start. "You the one who shot James Holloway?" The voice came from the shadows beside the stable. Ethan's hand moved instinctively toward his gun, but he stopped when he saw the speaker, an old man with a weathered face and eyes that had seen too much. "It was self-defense," Ethan said. "I believe you. James was a mean drunk, always had been, but believing you and helping you are two different things." The old man spat tobacco into the dust. "Sheriff's gonna hang you regardless of the truth. He loved that boy, even if the boy was rotten." "Then I'll take my chances on the trail." "Won't matter. Holloway's connected. He's got friends in every town between here and the territories. You run, you'll be running forever." Ethan felt the trap closing around him. "What would you suggest?" The old man stepped into the fading light. Up close, Ethan could see scars crossing his face, the kind you got from living a hard life and barely surviving it. There might be another way. Something that could clear your name and get you what you want. Land, a fresh start, all of it. "I'm listening." You hear about the gang gathering in the hills north of here? Outlaws calling themselves the Hale Company? Ethan had heard rumors on the trail, stories of a group of Confederate deserters turned bandits, led by a man named Victor Hale, who'd been a cavalry officer before the war broke him. They were supposed to be ghosts, hitting supply trains and disappearing into the wilderness. What about them? They're real, and they're planning something big, something that ain't just robbery. The old man's voice dropped to barely a whisper. Word is they've been hired for a job, an assassination, high-level targets, people whose deaths would change everything. Ethan's stomach turned. Assassination? Who? Don't know exactly, but I hear it involves peace negotiations, generals on both sides trying to end the fighting for good. Someone doesn't want that peace to happen. The implications crashed over Ethan like a wave. If what the old man said was true, someone was willing to kill to keep the war going, which meant someone was profiting from the continued bloodshed. Why tell me this? Because the sheriff might be convinced to overlook his brother's death if you bring him something bigger. Catch the men planning this assassination, expose whoever's funding them, and you might just save your own neck. The old man's eyes gleamed in the twilight. Plus, you'd be doing something that actually matters, saving lives instead of taking them. It was insane. It was impossible. But it was also the only option that didn't end with Ethan running forever or swinging from a rope. Where do I find this gang? They've got a camp about 30 miles north, in the Devil's Backbone Canyon. But you can't just ride up and ask to join. They're careful, paranoid. You'd need a way in. I'll figure it out. The old man studied him for a long moment. You're either very brave or very desperate. Right now, I'm both. Hoofbeats echoed down the main street, riders coming fast. The sheriff would be among them, and his grief would make him dangerous. Better go now, the old man said, before they surround this place. Ethan ducked into the livery and found his horse, a sturdy roan gelding that had carried him through 3 years of trail driving. The animal nickered in recognition as Ethan threw on the saddle, his hands working quickly through the familiar motions. Outside, voices rose in anger. Someone shouted his name. Torches were being lit as the sun finally dropped below the horizon, turning the sky blood red. Ethan led his horse out the back of the livery, staying low. The edge of town was only 50 yards away, just a sprint through the gathering darkness to open country. Beyond that lay the hills, the wilderness, and whatever truth waited in the Devil's Backbone. There! He's running! The shout came from behind him, followed by the sharp crack of a rifle. The bullet kicked up dust 3 feet to his left. Ethan vaulted into the saddle and spurred the roan forward, racing for the tree line as more shots rang out behind him. The horse stretched into a full gallop, powerful muscles churning beneath him. More rifle fire cracked through the air, but hitting a moving target in fading light was nearly impossible. Ethan leaned low over the horse's neck, urging more speed. They hit the tree line and plunged into shadow. Branches whipped past as Ethan guided the horse through the forest by instinct and moonlight. Behind him, the sounds of pursuit grew fainter. They'd need time to organize a proper posse, and by then he'd have hours of head start. But as the adrenaline began to fade, the reality of his situation settled over him like a cold blanket. He was a fugitive now. A wanted man with a price on his head and nowhere to call home. His money was worthless, his dreams were ashes, and his only hope of redemption lay in finding a gang of killers and somehow stopping an assassination plot he barely understood. Ethan rode through the night, following the North Star toward the Devil's Backbone. The frontier wind cut through his jacket, carrying the scent of pine and distant rain. Somewhere ahead was Victor Hale and his company of ghosts. Somewhere ahead was the truth about who wanted the war to continue and why. And somewhere behind him was Sheriff Holloway, who would never stop hunting until Ethan was dead or vindicated. The moon rose full and bright, casting silver light across the wild landscape. Ethan pushed the roan hard for the first hour, then eased back to a sustainable pace. The horse was strong, but even strong horses had limits. As dawn approached, painting the eastern sky in shades of pink and gold, Ethan found himself in rougher country. The gentle hills gave way to rocky outcroppings and steep ravines. This was the kind of land that swallowed men whole, where you could disappear and never be found. Perfect country for outlaws. He'd been riding for nearly 12 hours when he first saw the smoke, a thin column rising from a canyon about 2 miles ahead. Ethan reined in his horse and studied the terrain. The Devil's Backbone was a series of interconnected canyons, narrow passages between vertical rock walls. Easy to defend, impossible to escape from if you were trapped. Approaching openly would be suicide. These men were professionals, hardened by war and desperate enough to take the most dangerous jobs. They'd shoot first and never bother with questions. Ethan dismounted and led his horse on foot, moving carefully through the rocks. The sun was fully up now, warming the stone and throwing sharp shadows. He found a high point overlooking the canyon and settled in to watch. Below, perhaps a dozen men moved around a camp. They had the efficient, disciplined movements of soldiers, not the sloppy chaos of common bandits. Sentries were posted at both ends of the canyon. Horses were picketed in good order. These weren't desperate men. They were organized, well-funded, and dangerous. But organized by whom? And funded with what money? Ethan spent the day watching, learning their patterns. They changed sentries every 2 hours. At midday, a man who had to be Victor Hale, tall, scarred, with the bearing of someone accustomed to command, gathered the others for what looked like a briefing. Ethan was too far away to hear words, but he could read body language. These men were preparing for something specific, something soon. As afternoon shadows lengthened, Ethan worked his way down closer to the canyon mouth. He needed to make contact, but how? Walking in would get him killed. He needed leverage, needed to offer something they wanted. The sound of hoofbeats made him freeze. 3 riders were approaching the canyon from the south, newcomers. Ethan pressed himself against the rocks and watched. The riders were challenged by the sentries. Words were exchanged. Then one of the newcomers pulled something from his saddlebag, papers, maybe orders. The sentries stepped aside, and the riders entered the camp. Ethan's mind raced. If these were regular supply runs or new recruits, maybe he could intercept the next group, or maybe he could follow when they left, see where they came from. But as he watched the newcomers dismount and meet with Hale, a different idea began to form. A dangerous idea, but one that might actually work. He needed to become someone they couldn't afford to turn away. Ethan retreated to his hidden camp and spent the evening working through the details of his plan. It was built on assumptions and hope, 2 things that got men killed on the frontier, but it was all he had. The next morning he rode openly toward the canyon mouth, hands clearly visible and empty. The sentries spotted him immediately, rifles coming up to aim at his chest. "That's far enough," one of them shouted. "State your business or turn around." Ethan reined in his horse, keeping his hands raised. "My name's Ethan Rourke. I'm here to see Victor Hale." "The captain don't take social calls." "Tell him I have information about a sheriff's posse that's tracking him. Tell him I know who's funding his operation. And tell him I can help with his job, if the price is right." The 2 sentries exchanged glances. One of them gestured with his rifle. "Get down off that horse, slow." Ethan dismounted, his movements deliberate. They patted him down roughly, took his weapons, and one sentry disappeared into the canyon while the other kept a rifle trained on Ethan's chest. The wait felt like hours. Ethan stood in the morning sun, sweating despite the cool air, wondering if he'd just made the worst mistake of his life. These men had no reason to trust him, no reason to let him live. Finally, the sentry returned with 3 armed men. In the center walked Victor Hale. Up close, Hale was even more imposing. He stood well over 6 feet, with a face carved from weathered oak and eyes the color of winter ice. A scar ran from his left temple down to his jaw, pulling his mouth into a permanent slight sneer. He wore Confederate gray, faded but still recognizable, and moved with the controlled grace of a predator. "Ethan Rourke," Hale said, his voice carrying the accent of Virginia aristocracy. "My men tell me you have information. I'm inclined to shoot you as a spy, but I'm curious enough to hear you out first." Ethan met his gaze steadily. 3 days ago, I killed Sheriff Holloway's brother in Redemption Creek. Self-defense, but the sheriff doesn't care. He's put together a posse, and word is they're tracking anyone connected to Confederate operations. Your name came up. Hale's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. "And you came to warn me out of the goodness of your heart?" "I came because I need what you have. Protection, resources, and a way to make the money I need to start over. In exchange, I can offer skills. I spent 3 years as a trail boss, managing men, moving through hostile territory without being caught. I can shoot, track, and I know how to disappear when I need to. We're not a charity for fugitives. I'm not asking for charity. I'm asking for work. Ethan took a calculated risk. I heard you're planning something big, something that requires men who can handle themselves under pressure. I'm offering my services. Hale studied him in silence for a long moment. Then he smiled, and it was not a pleasant expression. You're either incredibly brave or incredibly stupid. Which is it? Probably both. But I'm also desperate, and desperate men work harder than anyone. True enough. Hale turned to one of his men. Rodriguez, what do you think? A lean, dark-haired man with a Mexican accent spoke up. Could be a spy, Captain. Could be exactly what he says. Either way, we'll know soon enough. Indeed we will. Hale turned back to Ethan. Here's what's going to happen, Mr. Rourke. You're going to spend the next few days proving you're worth keeping alive. If you prove useful, you might earn a place in my company. If you prove to be a spy or a liability, he left the threat hanging. Fair enough. Rodriguez will be your keeper. You'll do exactly what he says when he says it. You'll sleep with your hands tied, eat when we allow it, and answer every question we ask. Understood? Understood. Good. Hale's smile widened. Welcome to hell, Mr. Rourke. I hope you survive it. They bound his hands and led him deeper into the canyon. Ethan had crossed a threshold he couldn't uncross. He was inside the enemy's camp, surrounded by killers, with no backup and no guarantee he'd live to see tomorrow. But he was also one step closer to the truth, one step closer to stopping whatever darkness was about to be unleashed on the frontier, and one step closer to redemption, if such a thing still existed in a world as brutal and unforgiving as this. The canyon walls rose around him like the bars of a prison, and Ethan Rourke walked forward into the unknown, carrying nothing but his wits and the desperate hope that he could somehow turn his worst day into something that mattered. The sun climbed higher, burning away the morning cool, and ahead lay trials he couldn't imagine, and truths that would change everything he thought he knew about the war, about justice, and about how far men would go for power. But for now, he was alive. And on the frontier, sometimes that was all the hope you needed. The first 3 days in the canyon taught Ethan more about survival than 3 years on the cattle trail ever had. Rodriguez proved to be a hard teacher, the kind who believed in testing a man past his limits to see what broke first, body, mind, or spirit. On the morning of the 4th day, they cut the ropes binding his wrists. The skin underneath was raw and blistered, but Ethan didn't complain. Complaining was weakness, and weakness in a camp full of killers was an invitation to die. You're adapting well, Rodriguez said as they walked the perimeter of the camp. The Mexican moved like a ghost through the rocks, barely disturbing the dust. Most men would have broken by now, either begging to leave or trying to escape. I've got nowhere to go, Ethan replied honestly. And begging never solved anything. Rodriguez smiled thinly. The captain likes you, says you've got the eyes of a man who's seen death and made peace with it. That's rare. Death and I have an understanding. I try to avoid him, and sometimes he lets me. Today might test that understanding. Rodriguez stopped at the mouth of the canyon and pointed south. The captain's sending you on a supply run. Me, you, and 2 others. We're heading to a ranch about 40 miles from here. Ethan's pulse quickened, though he kept his face neutral. What kind of ranch? The kind that funds our operation. The owner's name is Leonard Drake. Rich man, made his fortune selling weapons to both sides during the war. Now he's investing in our particular venture. Rodriguez's dark eyes studied Ethan carefully. The captain wants to see how you handle yourself around civilized folk, whether you can keep your mouth shut and your eyes open. I can do both. We'll see. They rode out within the hour, Ethan, Rodriguez, and 2 men named Carter and Sullivan. Carter was a former artillery sergeant with arms like tree trunks and a permanent scowl. Sullivan was younger, maybe 19, with quick hands and nervous energy that suggested he'd seen combat and hadn't quite recovered. The landscape opened up as they left the canyons behind, rolling hills covered in scrub grass and scattered trees. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly, and Ethan found himself thinking about water, about shade, about anything except the growing certainty that he was riding deeper into something far worse than a simple assassination plot. Rodriguez, Ethan said carefully as they watered the horses at a creek. Drake, he's funding all this just to keep the war going? Smart question. Wrong time to ask it. Rodriguez didn't look up from his canteen. You want to stay alive, you stop thinking like a man with a conscience and start thinking like a man with a job to do. Hard to do a job when you don't understand the purpose. The purpose is money, Rourke. It's always money. Drake sells weapons. Peace means his inventory becomes worthless. War means he gets richer, simple as that. Carter laughed, a harsh sound like rocks grinding together. Boys got moral qualms, ain't that precious? I've got practical qualms, Ethan shot back. When this job goes sideways, and every job eventually does, I want to know who I'm really working for and what they'll do to protect themselves. Or to eliminate loose ends, Sullivan added quietly. It was the first time he'd spoken all day. Drake's got a reputation for cleaning up his messes. Permanently. The words hung in the air like smoke. Rodriguez mounted his horse without comment, and the others followed suit. They rode in silence for another hour before the landscape began to change, the wild frontier giving way to fenced pastures and cultivated fields. Drake's ranch appeared on the horizon like a mirage. It was massive, sprawling across a valley, with the main house sitting on a rise like a feudal castle. Barns, corrals, bunkhouses, and outbuildings spread in organized clusters. Armed men patrolled the perimeter, and Ethan counted at least a dozen guards visible from the road. Big operation, he murmured. Drake doesn't do anything small, Rodriguez said. The ranch is legitimate, mostly, provides cover for his other businesses. But make no mistake, everyone who works here knows what he really is. They were stopped at the main gate by two guards with rifles. Rodriguez showed them a folded paper with a wax seal, and the guards waved them through without question. As they rode toward the main house, Ethan studied everything, the layout of the buildings, the positions of the guards, the escape routes if things went wrong. Old habits from the trail died hard. A stable boy took their horses, and they were led inside through a side entrance. The interior of the house was a shock after weeks in the wilderness. Polished wood floors, expensive furniture, paintings on the walls. It smelled like cigar smoke and money. They were shown into a study where Leonard Drake waited behind a massive oak desk. He was perhaps 50, with silver hair combed back from a high forehead and the kind of face that smiled easily but never with his eyes. He wore an expensive suit that probably cost more than Ethan had earned in his entire life. Rodriguez, Drake said warmly, rising to shake hands. Right on schedule, as always, and you brought the new recruit Victor mentioned. Ethan Rourke, sir. Ethan took the offered hand. Drake's grip was firm but soft, the hand of a man who'd never done hard labor. Ah, yes. The cattle driver turned fugitive. Victor tells me you've impressed him, which is no small feat. Drake gestured to chairs. Please sit. Can I offer you something to drink? Whiskey? Wine? Water would be fine, Ethan said. Drake laughed. A practical man. I like that. He poured water from a crystal decanter and passed it over. Victor also tells me you're curious about our operation, that you ask questions. Ethan felt the danger in the room sharpen. I ask questions because I don't like walking into situations blind, but I know when to keep my mouth shut. Do you? Drake settled back into his chair, steepling his fingers. Then let me satisfy your curiosity, Mr. Rourke. What Victor and his men are planning is quite simple. They're going to prevent a peace treaty that would end the war. They're going to do this by eliminating certain key figures who are pushing for that treaty. In exchange, I'm paying them enough money to disappear and live comfortably for the rest of their lives. The casual way Drake spoke about assassination made Ethan's skin crawl. And you're doing this because peace is bad for business. I have warehouses full of rifles, ammunition, artillery pieces, all purchased in anticipation of continued conflict. If the war ends tomorrow, I'm bankrupt. If it continues for another year or two, I become one of the richest men in the country. Drake smiled. It's nothing personal, you understand. It's simply economics. Economics that costs lives. Everything costs lives, Mr. Rourke. The question is whether those lives mean more than the profit they generate. For me, the answer is simple. They don't. Rodriguez shifted uncomfortably in his chair, but said nothing. Carter and Sullivan stood by the door like statues. Why tell me all this? Ethan asked. Aren't you worried I'll run to the authorities? With what evidence? Your word against mine? Drake laughed again. No, Mr. Rourke. I'm telling you this because Victor believes you're committed to the cause, and I trust Victor's judgment. Also because once you participate in the operation, you're complicit. If the plan succeeds, you share in the reward. If it fails, you hang alongside everyone else. It was a trap disguised as opportunity, and Ethan had walked right into it. Every word Drake spoke was another bar in the cage closing around him. The supplies you need are being loaded as we speak, Drake continued. But I've asked you here for another reason. I'm hosting a dinner tonight with some associates, and I want you to see exactly what's at stake. The people who'll be there represent the full scope of our operation. Consider it your initiation into the reality of power, Mr. Rourke. Before Ethan could respond, there was a soft knock at the door. A young woman entered carrying a tray with fresh drinks. She was maybe 22, with dark hair pulled back and eyes that stayed fixed on the floor as she moved. Ah, Isabel, Drake said. Thank you, my dear. Just set it on the desk. The woman, Isabel, moved with the careful precision of someone trying to be invisible. As she set down the tray, Ethan noticed bruises on her wrists, barely concealed by her sleeves. She glanced up for just a second, and her eyes met his. Brown eyes filled with fear and something else. Desperation, maybe. A silent plea. Then she was gone, slipping out of the room like a ghost. Pretty thing, isn't she? Drake said casually. Found her in a town we passed through last year, orphaned by the war, nowhere to go. I took her in, gave her a home. She's quite grateful. The way he said grateful made Ethan's jaw clench. He'd seen that dynamic before on the frontier, powerful men who confused charity with ownership, kindness with control. Generous of you, Ethan managed to say. I'm a generous man to those who serve me well. Remember that. Drake stood, signaling the meeting was over. Rodriguez will show you to the bunkhouse. Dinner is at 7. Dress appropriately. There are clothes in your room that should fit. They were dismissed like servants, ushered out by a cold-eyed butler who materialized from nowhere. As they walked across the compound toward the bunkhouse, Ethan couldn't shake the image of Isabel's eyes or the bruises on her wrists. Don't, Rodriguez said quietly beside him. Don't what? Whatever you're thinking about that girl, don't. Drake owns her, same as he owns this land and everyone on it. You start making trouble over her, you'll end up dead, and she'll end up worse. How much worse can it get? Rodriguez grabbed Ethan's arm, stopping him. You really want to know? Drake has a temper. When he gets angry, people disappear. Sometimes they turn up later, broken. Sometimes they don't turn up at all. That girl survived this long by being useful and invisible. You shine a light on her, you sign her death warrant. Ethan pulled his arm free. So we just ignore it? We do the job we came here to do, and we get out. That's survival, Rourke. You want to be a hero, go somewhere else. The bunkhouse was sparse but clean. 6 beds, footlockers, a wood stove. Ethan found the clothes Drake had mentioned laid out on one of the beds. They fit surprisingly well, which suggested Drake had been planning this meeting longer than it appeared. As the afternoon wore on, other men filtered through, ranch hands, guards, people who worked for Drake in various capacities. They all gave the 4 visitors a wide berth, confirming what Ethan had already suspected. Hale's company had a reputation that preceded them. At 6:30, Rodriguez knocked on the doorframe. Time to get presentable. Drake doesn't tolerate tardiness. Dinner was held in a formal dining room that could seat 30 people. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, and the table was set with china and silver that gleamed in the candlelight. Ethan felt profoundly out of place in his borrowed finery, a wolf in sheep's clothing sitting among actual predators. The other guests arrived in pairs and small groups, men in expensive suits, a few women in elaborate dresses, all carrying themselves with the confidence of wealth and power. Drake introduced them with first names only, but Ethan caught enough context to understand who they were. Land speculators, railroad investors, politicians who'd managed to profit from the war regardless of which side they publicly supported. Isabel moved through the room serving wine, her face a carefully maintained mask of neutral politeness. Ethan watched Drake's hand brush against her lower back as she passed, possessive and casual, and saw her flinch so subtly that anyone not watching closely would have missed it. The dinner conversation was a masterclass in civilized corruption. The guests discussed trade routes and supply contracts, land seizures and political appointments, all of it wrapped in polite euphemisms that barely concealed the ruthlessness underneath. They spoke of securing assets when they meant theft, managing populations when they meant displacement, ensuring continuity when they meant preventing peace. The problem with peace, one of the land speculators said between courses, is that it creates stability, and stability makes it harder to acquire property at advantageous prices. Precisely, Drake agreed. War creates opportunity for those with the vision to seize it. Peace creates stagnation. But surely the conflict can't continue indefinitely, a woman in emerald silk said. People are tired. They want normalcy. People want what we tell them to want, a politician countered. With the right narrative, we can extend this war another 2 years easily. Maybe 3. Ethan felt sick. These weren't soldiers fighting for a cause, or even bandits stealing for survival. These were parasites, feeding on suffering and calling it business. Rodriguez caught his eye from across the table, his expression warning Ethan to keep his face neutral. Ethan forced himself to eat, to nod politely, to play the role of the impressed newcomer who was learning how the real world worked. After dinner, the men retired to Drake's study for cigars and brandy, while the women withdrew to another room. Ethan found himself standing near a window, watching the darkness outside and trying to process everything he'd heard. Overwhelming, isn't it? Drake appeared beside him, offering a cigar. Your first real glimpse of how power operates. It's something, Ethan said carefully. Most men never see this level of the game. They live and die believing in abstract concepts like justice and honor, never realizing that the world is run by people willing to set such concepts aside for practical advantage. Drake lit his cigar, the smoke curling upward. You have a choice now, Mr. Rourke. You can be one of the naive masses, or you can be one of us. Which will it be? Before Ethan could answer, there was a crash from somewhere deeper in the house, glass breaking, followed by a muffled cry. Drake's expression hardened. Excuse me, he said coldly, striding toward the door. Ethan followed at a distance, along with several other guests drawn by the commotion. They found Drake in a hallway outside the kitchen. Isabel was on the floor, her dress torn at the shoulder, broken china scattered around her. One of Drake's guards stood over her, his knuckles bleeding. She dropped the tray, the guard said defensively, then got mouthy about it. Drake's face was calm, but his eyes were ice. Isabel, stand up. The girl rose shakily, keeping her eyes down. A bruise was already forming on her cheek. Is this true? Did you speak disrespectfully to my guard? I apologized, sir. I didn't mean to. The slap came so fast Ethan barely saw it. Isabel's head snapped to the side and she stumbled against the wall. When I ask a question, you answer it directly. Did you or did you not speak disrespectfully? I did, sir. I'm sorry. Another slap, harder this time. Blood appeared at the corner of her mouth. Ethan's hand moved instinctively toward where his gun would normally be, but Rodriguez grabbed his wrist in a grip like iron. The Mexican's eyes warned him to stay still, stay silent, stay alive. You're becoming more trouble than you're worth, Drake said to Isabel. His voice was conversational, pleasant even, which somehow made it worse. I've been generous, given you a home, fed you, clothed you. And how do you repay me? With clumsiness and disrespect. Please, Mr. Drake, I'll do better. You're right, you will. Drake turned to the guard. Take her to the cellar. Let her think about gratitude for a few days. As the guard grabbed Isabel's arm, her eyes swept the hallway, meeting Ethan's for a fraction of a second. In that moment, he saw everything. The fear, the pain, the hopelessness of someone trapped in a nightmare with no escape. Then she was dragged away, and the moment passed. My apologies, gentlemen, Drake said smoothly, turning back to his guests. Disciplining servants is always unpleasant, but necessary. Shall we return to the study? The other guests murmured their understanding and filed back toward the cigars and brandy, the incident already forgotten. To them, Isabel was property that had malfunctioned, nothing more. Ethan stood frozen in the hallway, Rodriguez's hand still gripping his wrist. Don't, the Mexican whispered. There's nothing you can do. Not here, not now. He's going to kill her. Eventually, probably. But if you try to help her now, he'll kill you both. Is that what you want? Ethan forced himself to breathe, to think past the rage building in his chest. Rodriguez was right. Playing hero would accomplish nothing except getting them both killed. But doing nothing felt like a betrayal of everything that still remained decent in him. They returned to the study where the conversation had already moved on to other topics. Ethan accepted a brandy he didn't want and listened to men discuss profit margins while somewhere beneath them, a terrified woman sat in darkness wondering if she'd see another sunrise. The evening finally ended near midnight. The guests departed in their carriages, calling out pleasantries to Drake as if they hadn't just witnessed him beat a helpless woman. Ethan and the others were shown back to the bunkhouse, where Carter and Sullivan immediately fell into their beds. Rodriguez sat on the edge of his bunk, cleaning his pistol with methodical precision. "You did well tonight," he said quietly. "Kept your mouth shut, didn't make trouble. The captain will hear good things." "Good things," Ethan repeated bitterly. "I watched a man beat a woman and did nothing. I listened to parasites plan to keep a war going so they could profit from death. What part of that is good?" "The part where you're still breathing." Rodriguez held up his pistol, checking the action. "This world doesn't reward heroes, Rourke. It buries them. You want to survive, you learn to pick your battles. And if I can't live with that, then you won't live long." Ethan lay awake most of the night, staring at the ceiling and wrestling with impossible choices. He'd infiltrated Hale's company to stop the assassination and clear his name. But now he'd seen the full scope of the conspiracy, Drake and his network of corrupt officials and businessmen, all working to perpetuate suffering for profit. Stopping the assassination wouldn't be enough. The rot went too deep. And then there was Isabel, trapped in Drake's house like a bird in a cage. Ethan knew what happened to women like her in situations like this. He'd seen it before on the frontier, the slow destruction of spirit that came from being owned, used, discarded. As dawn light began to creep through the windows, Ethan made a decision. He would find a way to help her. Not today. Not in any way that would get them both killed, but somehow. He'd add it to the growing list of wrongs he needed to right, if he lived long enough. The next morning, they loaded supplies onto a wagon, ammunition, preserved food, medical supplies, and several crates whose contents Rodriguez wouldn't discuss. As they worked, Ethan caught glimpses of the main house, watching for any sign of Isabel. She appeared briefly on an upper balcony, carrying linens. Even from a distance, Ethan could see she moved stiffly, painfully. The beating had been worse than he'd witnessed. "Stop looking," Rodriguez said sharply. "You're making it obvious. Does it bother you, what Drake does to her?" Rodriguez was silent for a moment. "I've seen worse. War teaches you that there's always something worse." "That's not an answer." "It's the only answer I've got." They were preparing to leave when a house servant approached Rodriguez with a folded note. The Mexican read it quickly, his expression darkening. "Change of plans. Drake wants to see you alone before we go." Ethan felt his stomach drop. "Why?" "Didn't say. But when Drake summons you, you don't ask questions." Ethan followed the servant back to the main house, his mind racing through possibilities. Had Drake somehow sensed his revulsion? Had someone reported the look that passed between him and Isabel? Was this where his infiltration ended, with a bullet in a rich man's study? But when he entered Drake's office, the man was smiling, expansive and welcoming. "Mr. Rourke, thank you for indulging me. I wanted a private word before you returned to Victor's camp." Drake gestured to a chair. "Sit, please." Ethan sat, every instinct screaming danger. "Last night was a test," Drake said bluntly. "I wanted to see how you'd react to the realities of our operation. Some men can stomach it, others can't. You passed." "Did I?" "You kept quiet when you wanted to speak. You didn't interfere when you wanted to act. That shows discipline, Mr. Rourke. Discipline is rarer than courage and far more valuable." Drake poured 2 glasses of whiskey and pushed one toward Ethan. "Victor is planning something extraordinary. He hasn't shared all the details with you yet, but he will. And when he does, I want you to understand something important." "What's that?" "This assassination. It's not just about killing a few generals. It's about reshaping the entire future of this country. The men who die will be martyrs, used to justify another year or 2 of conflict. In that time, the South will collapse completely. The North will consolidate power. And people like me will own every railroad, every mine, every inch of valuable land from here to the Pacific. Drake's eyes gleamed. We're not just preserving a war, Mr. Rourke. We're building an empire. The scope of the conspiracy took Ethan's breath away. And what happens to the people caught in the middle? The soldiers, the families, the towns destroyed? They become history, footnotes in the story of progress. Drake raised his glass. To the future, Mr. Rourke. May we all be on the right side of it. Ethan didn't raise his glass. What if I can't be part of this? Then you die. Simple as that. Drake's smile never wavered. You've seen too much, know too much. You're either with us or you're a threat to be eliminated. Victor understands this. His men understand this. The question is, do you? It wasn't really a question. It was a statement of fact, delivered with the casual certainty of a man who held all the power. Ethan raised his glass and drank, the whiskey burning all the way down. I understand. Excellent. Then we have nothing more to discuss. Drake stood, extending his hand. I look forward to celebrating our success with you, Mr. Rourke. It should be quite the spectacle. As Ethan left the house and walked back to the waiting wagon, he felt the full weight of what he'd gotten himself into. He was trapped in a conspiracy that reached far beyond a simple assassination. He was surrounded by men who saw human life as nothing more than a commodity to be spent for profit, and he was running out of time to stop any of it. Rodriguez gave him a questioning look as Ethan climbed onto the wagon, but didn't ask what had happened. They rode out in silence, the ranch receding behind them until it was just another shimmer on the horizon. They were perhaps 5 miles from Drake's property when Rodriguez suddenly reined in his horse. Hold up. Something in his tone made everyone alert. Carter and Sullivan reached for their weapons. What is it? Ethan asked. Rodriguez pointed to a ridge about a quarter-mile ahead. Riders, 3 of them, watching us. Ethan squinted against the sun. Sure enough, 3 silhouettes sat on horseback along the ridgeline, motionless as statues. Could be Drake's men, Sullivan suggested. Could be, or could be trouble. Rodriguez studied them for a long moment. Carter, Sullivan, flank wide left and right. Rourke and I will continue straight. If they're hostile, we'll catch them in a crossfire. The 2 men spurred their horses and split off, circling wide. Rodriguez and Ethan continued forward at a steady pace, hands near their weapons but not drawn. As they got closer, the 3 riders descended from the ridge and moved to intercept them. They were rough-looking men, armed and dangerous, but something about them didn't quite fit the profile of bandits. The leader was a woman. She rode ahead of the other 2, sitting tall in the saddle despite visible signs of recent hardship. Her clothes were torn and dirty, her face bruised, but her eyes were clear and hard as flint. Rodriguez's hand tightened on his reins. I know her. That's Lena Garrett. She worked at Drake's ranch. The woman, Lena, stopped about 20 yards away. Rodriguez, fancy meeting you out here. Lena, thought you were still under Drake's employ. I was, until 2 nights ago when I decided I'd rather take my chances with the desert than spend another day in that hell. Her eyes shifted to Ethan. You're new. One of Hale's men? Something like that, Ethan said carefully. Then you've seen what Drake is, what he does to the people who work for him. She gestured to the 2 men flanking her. We all have, and we're done with it. Rodriguez's face remained impassive. Running from Drake is suicide. He doesn't let people go, especially people who know his business. I know. That's why we're not running far. We're going to expose him. To who? The authorities? The ones he owns? Rodriguez laughed without humor. You're already dead, Lena. You just don't know it yet. But Ethan was looking at her more closely, seeing something Rodriguez missed. You know something. Something specific about the assassination. Lena's eyes locked on his. I know everything. Dates, locations, targets. I know because I've been cleaning Drake's study for 6 months, and rich men don't think servants have ears. She paused. I also know about Isabel. What Drake did to her last night wasn't the first time. Won't be the last either, unless someone stops him. The mention of Isabel's name sent a jolt through Ethan. Is she still alive? Barely. But she won't be for long if someone doesn't help her. Lena's voice cracked slightly. She's my sister. The words hung in the hot desert air like a verdict. Ethan looked at Rodriguez, whose expression had gone carefully blank. This isn't our problem, Rodriguez said flatly. Maybe not, Ethan replied, but it's mine. He dismounted and walked toward Lena, ignoring Rodriguez's sharp intake of breath. Tell me what you know. All of it. Lena studied him for a long moment, weighing trust against desperation. Finally, she began to talk, and what she revealed would change everything. Lena's words came out in a rush, like water breaking through a dam. The assassination is set for 6 days from now, dawn on the 14th. There's a military outpost called Fort Harrison, about 90 miles northeast of here. 2 generals are meeting there, one Union, one Confederate, to negotiate a ceasefire agreement. Which generals? Ethan asked. General William Ashford from the Union side, General Robert Kincaid from the Confederate. They're the only 2 commanders on both sides who actually want peace. If they die, the moderates lose their voice and the warhawks take over. Lena's hands trembled as she spoke. Drake's been planning this for months. Hale's men will infiltrate the fort disguised as soldiers. They've got Union uniforms, proper identification papers, everything. Once inside, they'll plant explosives near the command building where the generals will meet. Rodriguez swore under his breath. That's suicide. Fort Harrison has a full garrison. Even if they get in, they'll never get out alive. They don't plan to all get out. Hale's dividing his company. Half will plant the explosives and trigger them, creating chaos. The other half will use the confusion to escape in the panic. The ones who stay behind are being paid triple, with the money going to their families. Lena's voice dropped to barely a whisper. Drake calls them necessary sacrifices for the greater profit. Ethan felt sick. And you learned all this how? By being invisible. Men like Drake think servants are furniture. They talk freely around us, never imagining we might be listening or that we'd understand what they're saying. She reached into her saddlebag and pulled out a folded document. I stole this from Drake's study the night I escaped. It's got the whole plan, names, dates, supply routes, everything. Rodriguez snatched the paper and unfolded it, his eyes scanning rapidly. His face went pale. This is real. This is the actual operational plan. He looked up at Lena with something like respect. You know Drake will hunt you to the ends of the earth for this. He'll hunt me anyway for running. At least this way, maybe I can stop him before he kills my sister. Lena turned back to Ethan. Isabel overheard Drake discussing the final details 2 nights ago. She didn't know I was planning to escape, didn't know I'd steal the documents. She went to Drake and asked him, begged him, to reconsider. She thought she could appeal to some humanity in him. The way Lena's voice broke on the last word told Ethan everything he needed to know. What did Drake do? He beat her unconscious. When she came to, he told her she had 48 hours to prove her loyalty or he'd make her disappear permanently. Lena's eyes glistened with tears she wouldn't let fall. I tried to get her to come with me when I ran, but she was too afraid. Said if she ran, Drake would hunt her forever. If she stayed and kept quiet, maybe she'd survive. She won't, Rodriguez said flatly. Drake doesn't leave loose ends, and she knows too much. He'll wait until after the assassination. Then she'll have an accident. The casual certainty in his voice made Ethan's blood run cold. Then we have to get her out before the assassination happens. We? Rodriguez stared at him. What do you mean, we? Our job is to get these supplies back to camp and keep our mouths shut. This isn't our fight. It is now. Ethan took the document from Rodriguez's hands. We have proof of the conspiracy. We have the timeline. We can stop this. And do what exactly? Ride into Fort Harrison and warn them that an assassination is coming? They'll arrest us as Confederate spies before we finish the first sentence. Rodriguez shook his head. You're thinking like a hero again, Rourke. That's how you get buried. Then I'll get buried doing something that matters instead of helping monsters profit from death. The 2 men locked eyes, and for a moment Ethan thought Rodriguez might draw on him. But then something shifted in the Mexican's expression, a crack in the cynical armor he wore like protection. You really believe you can stop this? Rodriguez asked quietly. I believe I have to try. Carter and Sullivan had circled back and now sat on their horses watching the confrontation with wary eyes. Carter spoke up first. Rodriguez, if we go back to camp now, And Rourke tells the captain what he knows. We're all implicated. But if we help him stop this, maybe we get out clean. Nothing about this is clean, Rodriguez muttered. But Ethan could see him calculating odds, weighing options. Finally, he sighed. If we do this, and that's a massive if, we need a plan that doesn't get us all killed. Running into Fort Harrison won't work. We need to stop Hale before his men even reach the fort. How? Lena asked. They're already preparing to move out. According to the timeline in those documents, they leave the canyon tomorrow. Ethan's mind raced. Then we intercept them on the trail. We know their route from the documents. We find a choke point, somewhere we can bottle them up. With what army? Sullivan spoke for the first time, his young voice tight with stress. There's 4 of us against Hale's entire company. Even if we had the tactical advantage, we'd be outnumbered 3-1. 5 of us, Lena corrected. She gestured to her 2 companions. Marcus and Thomas aren't fighters, but they can shoot. And they've got as much reason to stop Drake as anyone. Rodriguez studied the document again, tracing his finger along the marked route. There's a narrow pass here, about 40 miles from the canyon. It's called Devil's Gate. Rock walls on both sides, only wide enough for 2 horses abreast. If we could get there first, set up a barricade. We'd be sitting ducks when they arrived, Carter finished. They'd just wait us out or go around. Not if we make them think there's a bigger force waiting, not if we create enough chaos that they break and run. Ethan looked at each of them in turn. We don't have to kill them all. We just have to stop them from reaching Fort Harrison. You're forgetting something, Rodriguez said. Even if we stop the assassination, Drake still has his network. He'll just hire someone else, plan another attack. We cut off 1 head, 3 more grow back. Then we cut off all the heads. Ethan's voice was hard. We stop the assassination, we rescue Isabel, and we expose Drake's entire conspiracy. The documents Lena stole are evidence. With those and witness testimony, we can bring down his whole operation. Witness testimony from who? Escaped servants and wanted fugitives? Rodriguez laughed bitterly. The authorities won't believe us. They're probably in Drake's pocket anyway. Not all of them. General Ashford, if he's really pushing for peace, he must be clean. We get these documents to him before the assassination attempt. He'll have to act. The logic was thin, held together more by desperation than probability. But it was something, and something was better than watching the world burn while doing nothing. Lena pulled out a worn map and spread it across her saddle. Fort Harrison is here. Drake's ranch is here. The canyon where Hale's company camps is here. She traced the routes with her finger. If Hale leaves tomorrow at dawn like the plan says, he'll reach Devil's Gate by tomorrow night. We'd have to ride hard to get there before him. What about Isabel? Ethan asked. We can't leave her at Drake's ranch. We can't save her and stop the assassination, Rodriguez said. There's not enough time to do both. We have to choose. The words hit Ethan like a punch. Choose between saving 1 woman and stopping a conspiracy that would kill hundreds, maybe thousands. It was the kind of impossible decision that had no right answer, only degrees of wrong. If we stop the assassination first, Lena said slowly, Drake will know his plan failed. He'll disappear, taking Isabel with him. We'll never find her again. And if we go after Isabel first, Carter added, Hale reaches Fort Harrison and the generals die. The war continues. More people suffer. Sullivan cleared his throat nervously. Maybe there's another way. What if we split up? Some of us go to Devil's Gate to stop Hale, others go back to Drake's ranch for Isabel. That leaves both groups too small to succeed at either task, Rodriguez said. We'd fail twice instead of once. Ethan closed his eyes, trying to think past the impossible weight of the choice. Then something occurred to him. The timeline. When exactly does Isabel's 48 hours run out? Lena checked the dates mentally. Tomorrow night, late tomorrow night, maybe early the following morning. And when does Hale plan to plant the explosives at Fort Harrison? Dawn the day after tomorrow. A plan began to form in Ethan's mind, fragile and dangerous, but possible. What if we don't have to choose? What if we do both, just not at the same time? Rodriguez raised an eyebrow. I'm listening. We split into 2 groups, but not equal. Most of us go to Devil's Gate to stop Hale. One person, Someone who knows Drake's ranch goes back for Isabel. Ethan looked at Lena. You know the layout. You know where they'd keep her. Could you get in and out alone? Maybe, probably. But what happens when I get her out? Drake's men will chase us. You don't run far. You take Isabel and hide somewhere close. Somewhere you can watch the ranch. When the rest of us finish at Devil's Gate, we'll come for you. Then we all ride together to Fort Harrison with the evidence. It was full of holes and assumptions, but Rodriguez was nodding slowly. It could work. If Lena can stay hidden for a day, if we can actually stop Hale at the pass, if Drake doesn't figure out what's happening until it's too late. That's a lot of ifs, Carter muttered. It's better than no ifs, Ethan shot back. We either try this or we give up and let Drake win. Lena studied the map again, her jaw set with determination. There's an old line shack about 3 miles from Drake's ranch. Abandoned for years, but it's got a root cellar. I could hide Isabel there until you come. How will you get into the ranch? Same way I got out, through the drainage culvert that runs under the south wall. Drake doesn't know about it, or didn't when I left. She looked up, meeting Ethan's eyes. I can do this. I can save my sister. Then it's decided, Ethan said. Lena goes after Isabel tonight. The rest of us ride for Devil's Gate and set up our ambush. We stop Hale, then circle back and help Lena. Together we ride to Fort Harrison and expose the whole conspiracy. Rodriguez took a deep breath and let it out slowly. I can't believe I'm agreeing to this. But all right, we do it your way, Rourke. But if this goes sideways and we all end up dead, I'm haunting you in the afterlife. Get in line. They spent the next hour planning details, sight lines at Devil's Gate, what weapons and supplies they'd need, contingency plans if something went wrong. Lena would take one of the horses and head for Drake's ranch immediately. The others would push the wagon hard, stopping only to rest the horses, and reach Devil's Gate by late tomorrow. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the desert, Lena prepared to leave. She gripped Ethan's hand briefly. Thank you, she said simply, for caring about someone you barely know. I've seen too many people not care. It's time someone did. She mounted her horse and turned toward the southern horizon where Drake's ranch lay waiting like a spider's web. Marcus and Thomas would ride with the wagon to Devil's Gate, adding their guns to the ambush. Ethan watched Lena disappear into the shimmering heat haze, carrying the weight of her sister's life on her shoulders. Then he turned to Rodriguez. Let's move. We've got a lot of ground to cover. They pushed the horses hard through the afternoon and into the evening, eating in the saddle and stopping only when the animals absolutely needed rest. The landscape grew rougher as they traveled northeast, the gentle hills giving way to broken country of deep arroyos and stone outcroppings. As night fell, they made a cold camp in a dry wash, not risking a fire that might give away their position. They were still technically in Drake's territory, and meeting any of his patrols would raise questions they couldn't answer. Tell me about Hale, Ethan said to Rodriguez as they sat in the darkness. What kind of man are we really facing? Rodriguez was quiet for a moment. You know he was a cavalry officer during the war? I'd heard. What you probably didn't hear was that he was one of the best. Brilliant tactician, brave to the point of madness, completely loyal to the cause. His men would have followed him into hell itself. Rodriguez paused. Then came the Battle of Cedar Creek. You hear about that? Ethan shook his head. Massacre would be a better word. Hale's entire regiment was ordered to charge a fortified position, suicide mission from the start. Half his men died in the first 5 minutes. Hale kept charging because those were his orders, even as everyone around him fell. By the time they called the retreat, 3/4 of his regiment was dead or dying. What happened to him? Something broke. Not his courage or his skill, those stayed intact, but his faith in the cause, in the generals who gave orders, in the idea that the war had meaning beyond slaughter. After Cedar Creek, he deserted, took the survivors who were willing to follow, and disappeared into the frontier. Rodriguez stared up at the stars. The man you'll face at Devil's Gate isn't the idealist who started the war. He's what's left after the idealism burns away. Pure survival instinct and absolute willingness to do whatever it takes. Sounds like he's got reasons to hate the people who ordered him to fight. He does. That's what makes him dangerous. Drake didn't hire a simple mercenary. He hired a man who wants to watch the world that destroyed him burn. The words hung heavy in the night air. Somewhere out there, Victor Hale was preparing to lead his men on a mission that would kill peace itself. And tomorrow, Ethan would have to stop him with a plan built on hope and desperation. They set out again before dawn, racing the rising sun toward Devil's Gate. The terrain grew more treacherous, forcing them to slow the wagon and pick their way carefully through rocky passages. By mid-morning, they could see the pass ahead, two massive rock walls rising like the gates to damnation itself. "This is it," Rodriguez said, surveying the landscape with a tactical eye. "If we're going to make a stand, this is where it happens." They spent hours preparing. Carter and Sullivan positioned rocks to create a barricade across the narrowest part of the pass. Marcus and Thomas, Lena's companions, gathered deadwood and built what looked like multiple campfires spread across the heights, giving the impression of a larger force. Ethan and Rodriguez scouted the surrounding area, looking for escape routes if they needed them. As the sun began its descent, they took their positions. Carter and Sullivan held the barricade with the wagon pulled across to block the pass. Rodriguez and Ethan climbed to higher ground on opposite sides, creating a crossfire. Marcus and Thomas were spread out with instructions to light multiple fires when signaled, making it look like dozens of men waited in the rocks. Then came the waiting. Ethan crouched behind a boulder, his rifle ready, watching the trail that led to the pass. The afternoon heat was oppressive, making the air shimmer and waver. Sweat trickled down his back beneath his shirt. His mouth was dry despite the water in his canteen. The silence of the desert was absolute, broken only by the occasional cry of a hawk circling overhead. Time seemed to slow, each minute stretching into an eternity of tension and doubt. What if Hale didn't come this way? What if they'd misread the route on the documents? What if the whole plan collapsed before it even started? But then, as the sun touched the horizon, Rodriguez gave a low whistle, the signal. Riders approaching. Ethan's heart hammered as he spotted them. A column of perhaps 20 men riding in formation through the desert, heading straight for Devil's Gate. Even from a distance, he could pick out Victor Hale at the head of the column, sitting tall in the saddle like a commander leading troops into battle. The column reached the mouth of the pass and slowed. Hale raised a hand, bringing his men to a halt. Even from his elevated position, Ethan could sense the man's wariness, the instinct that had kept him alive through countless battles. "The pass is blocked," Hale's voice carried in the still air. Could be natural rockfall, could be something else. One of his lieutenants, a man Ethan didn't recognize, spoke up. "Want me to take a few men and check it out, Captain?" "No. If it's an ambush, I want everyone together." Hale studied the high ground on both sides of the pass, and for a terrible moment, Ethan thought those ice-cold eyes looked directly at him. "Light the torches. We go through in force." As Hale's men prepared to advance, Rodriguez struck a match and lit the first of their prepared fires. Within seconds, flames sprang up at multiple points along both sides of the pass. Then Marcus and Thomas lit theirs, and suddenly it looked like dozens of campfires blazed in the rocks above. Hale's men shifted nervously in their saddles. The apparent size of the force waiting for them had given them pause. "Captain," another man called out, "that's a lot of fires. Could be a full company up there. Or could be half a dozen men trying to make us think there's a full company." Hale's voice was calm, analytical. "Anyone shows themselves, you shoot them. Otherwise, we ride through steady and organized. They want to stop us. They'll have to do it with more than campfires." The column began to advance into the pass, moving slowly and cautiously. Ethan's finger tightened on his rifle trigger, but he held fire. The plan was to let them get deeper into the pass, trapped between the rock walls where they couldn't maneuver. Hale reached the barricade and reined in his horse. He studied the wagon and rocks blocking the way, then looked up at the heights where firelight flickered. "Whoever you are," Hale called out, his voice echoing between the stone walls, "you've made your point. We're impressed. Now move aside and let us through, and nobody has to die today." Silence was the only answer. "We're not looking for a fight," Hale continued. "We're just passing through on legitimate business. You let us by, we'll forget we ever saw you." Rodriguez caught Ethan's eye across the pass and shook his head slightly. "Don't respond. Don't give away our position or numbers." But Ethan knew silence wouldn't be enough. Hale was too smart, too experienced. He'd call the bluff eventually, realize how few defenders there actually were. They needed to create chaos, needed to make Hale believe the cost of forcing through was too high. Ethan took careful aim at the ground, just in front of Hale's horse, and fired. The shot cracked through the air like thunder. Dust kicked up where the bullet struck, and Hale's horse reared, causing the other animals to panic. Men shouted in surprise, reaching for their weapons. "The next one goes through flesh instead of dirt," Ethan called out, disguising his voice as best he could. "Turn around and go back the way you came." Hale fought his horse under control, his eyes scanning the heights. "How many are you, 10? 20? Because I've got 23 men here, all of them veterans. You really want to start a war you can't win." "We don't want war at all," Rodriguez shouted from the other side. "That's why you're not getting through. Whatever Drake's paying you, it's not worth dying in this pass." The mention of Drake's name changed something in Hale's expression. His hand went to his sidearm. "Who are you? How do you know about Drake?" "We know everything," Ethan replied. "We know about Fort Harrison, we know about the generals, we know about the explosives, and we know you're not getting through here to complete that mission." For several long seconds, nobody moved. The only sound was wind whistling through the pass and the nervous shifting of horses. Hale's mind was clearly working through the mathematics of the situation. How many guns waited in the rocks, what his odds were of forcing through, what the cost would be. Then Hale did something unexpected. He laughed. "Drake warned me he had loose ends, said he'd handled them." Hale's voice carried genuine amusement. "Apparently he was wrong. So tell me, are you the servants who ran? The conscience-stricken supply runners? Or maybe the cattle driver with delusions of heroism?" The specificity of the last description made Ethan's blood run cold. Hale knew who he was, which meant Drake had told him, which meant they'd been expected. "Doesn't matter who we are," Carter shouted from the barricade. "You're not getting through." "You're right," Hale said calmly. "We're not getting through here, but we don't have to." He made a sharp gesture, and his men immediately began to wheel their horses around. Within seconds, the entire column was retreating back the way they'd come, leaving the pass behind. Rodriguez fired a shot over their heads, but Hale didn't even flinch. His men rode at a controlled pace, not panicked, but organized. In minutes, they disappeared from view around a bend in the trail. "Did we win?" Sullivan called up from the barricade, his voice uncertain. "No," Ethan said, a terrible realization dawning. "We didn't." He scrambled down from his position and ran to where Rodriguez was descending from the opposite side. "He's going around. There must be another route to Fort Harrison." Rodriguez pulled out the map they'd been using, studying it in the fading light. "There is. Longer, rougher terrain, but possible. If Hale pushes hard through the night, he could reach the fort by dawn tomorrow." "Which is when the assassination is supposed to happen," Carter said, joining them. "He was expecting us," Ethan said. "Drake must have figured out that Lena stole the documents. He warned Hale to expect interference." "So what now?" Sullivan asked. "We chase them? We can't catch them on horseback. They've got too much of a head start, and they're riding light while we've got the wagon." Rodriguez folded the map with sharp, angry movements. "We failed, Rourke. Your plan didn't work." But Ethan was already thinking ahead, desperate for a solution. "How far is Fort Harrison from here if we cut straight northeast instead of following the roads?" Rodriguez consulted the map again. "Maybe 60 miles, but that's across rough country, no trails. Could take us all night even pushing hard." "So we push hard. We leave the wagon, take only what we can carry, and ride straight for the fort. If we can get there before Hale and warn them—" "They won't believe us," Carter interrupted. "We show up claiming there's an assassination plot, they'll think we're the assassins. Then we make them believe. We show them the documents Lena stole. We force them to take the threat seriously." Ethan looked at each of them. "It's not perfect, but it's all we've got." Rodriguez stared at him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "All right, we ride for Fort Harrison, but we're running out of miracles, Rourke. Eventually, our luck runs out." They abandoned the wagon and took only essential supplies: water, ammunition, the stolen documents. The horses were already tired from the hard riding of the past day, but they'd have to push harder still. As full darkness fell, they rode northeast across terrain that seemed designed to kill travelers. Rocky ground that could break a horse's leg in the darkness. sudden drop-offs that appeared without warning, thorny brush that tore at both riders and animals. They rode through the night, guided by stars and desperate hope. Ethan's world narrowed to the rhythm of hoofbeats, the creak of leather, the labored breathing of his exhausted horse. His body ached from days in the saddle, but he pushed the pain aside and kept riding. Somewhere ahead was Fort Harrison and two generals who had no idea death was coming for them. Somewhere behind was Lena, hopefully hidden with Isabel, waiting for rescue. And somewhere in between was Victor Hale, racing toward his objective with the single-minded purpose of a man who'd already lost everything and had nothing left to fear. Dawn was perhaps 2 hours away when they heard the first explosion. The sound rolled across the desert like distant thunder, followed seconds later by another, then another. Ethan reined in his horse, his heart sinking as he saw the glow on the northeastern horizon, fires burning where Fort Harrison should be. "We're too late," Sullivan whispered. "No," Rodriguez said, though his voice carried no conviction. "Could be something else. Could be unrelated." But they all knew better. The timing was too perfect, the location too precise. While they'd been scrambling across the desert, Hale had reached the fort and struck. "We keep going," Ethan said, though despair clawed at his chest. "Maybe someone survived. Maybe we can still expose Drake's conspiracy." They rode the last few miles at a gallop, their horses foaming and nearly spent. As they crested the final ridge overlooking Fort Harrison, the full scope of the catastrophe became clear. The command building was a shattered ruin, still burning despite efforts to douse the flames. Bodies lay scattered across the compound, soldiers caught by the blast, others killed in the chaos that followed. Survivors moved through the carnage like ghosts, trying to make sense of what had happened. And in the center of it all, Ethan saw a group of prisoners being held under guard, men in Union uniforms who'd been caught trying to escape. Even from a distance, Ethan recognized Victor Hale among them, his face bloody but defiant. "What happened?" Carter asked, his voice hollow. "He did it," Ethan replied. "He actually did it." They rode down into the fort slowly, trying not to attract attention. The guards at the perimeter were more concerned with the devastation inside than with a few more riders approaching. Ethan and the others dismounted and walked into the chaos. A colonel with soot-stained face and haunted eyes was trying to organize the survivors. Ethan approached him carefully. "Sir, I need to speak with whoever's in command." "I'm in command." "What's left of it?" The colonel looked at him with dead eyes. "Who are you?" "My name's Ethan Rourke. These men and I have information about the attack, about who planned it and why. The attack was carried out by Confederate infiltrators trying to disrupt peace negotiations. We know who planned it, the enemy, same as always." The colonel turned away. "If you're not here to help with the wounded, move along." "General Ashford," Ethan said desperately. "General Kincaid, are they—" "Dead, both of them, killed instantly when the explosives detonated." The colonel's voice cracked. 23 other men died with them, good men who believed we were building toward peace. The words hit Ethan like physical blows. They'd failed. Despite everything, all the desperate plans, the dangerous risks, the racing against time, they'd failed to prevent exactly what they'd set out to stop. "The men you captured," Rodriguez said, "the ones in Union uniforms, they're not really Union, are they?" "Obviously not. Confederate agents with forged papers. We caught them trying to slip away during the confusion." The colonel's hand went to his sidearm. "They'll hang for this. Every last one of them." "They're not working for the Confederacy," Ethan said urgently. "They're mercenaries hired by a war profiteer named Leonard Drake. This whole attack was designed to prevent peace so Drake could keep selling weapons." The colonel stared at him. "That's quite an accusation. You have proof?" Ethan pulled out the documents Lena had stolen and thrust them at the colonel. "It's all here. Names, dates, supply routes, everything. Drake funded this attack to keep the war going for his own profit." The colonel took the documents but barely glanced at them. "Even if this is real, it doesn't change what happened. The generals are dead. The peace negotiations are over. The war continues." He handed the papers back. "Take your conspiracy theories elsewhere. We have actual problems to deal with." "You have to listen," Ethan started, but Rodriguez grabbed his arm. "Let it go," the Mexican said quietly. "He's right. It's over. They stood there in the smoking ruins of Fort Harrison, surrounded by the dead and dying, and felt the full weight of failure crash down on them. Everything they'd done, all the danger, all the sacrifice, had amounted to nothing. The assassination had succeeded. The war would continue, and Drake would profit from every death that followed. As the sun rose over the devastation, painting the sky in shades of red that looked too much like blood, Ethan realized they had one mission left. They'd failed to stop the assassination, but maybe they could still save Isabel. Maybe they could still bring down Drake's empire, even if the larger conspiracy had already won. "We need to go back for Lena," Ethan said to the others. "She's still out there with Isabel, waiting for us." "If Drake hasn't already found them," Carter said grimly, "then we ride fast and hope we're not too late for that too." They left Fort Harrison behind, carrying the stolen documents that no one would believe, and the crushing knowledge that sometimes being right wasn't enough. Sometimes the monsters won anyway. The ride back toward Drake's ranch was a blur of exhaustion and desperation. They'd been in the saddle for nearly 2 days straight, and the horses were on the verge of collapse. But they pushed on, driven by the single remaining thread of hope that maybe, just maybe, Lena and Isabel had stayed hidden and safe. As they approached the area where the abandoned line shack should be, the afternoon sun beat down mercilessly. The landscape looked exactly as it had before: empty, harsh, unforgiving. There, Rodriguez pointed to a barely visible structure half collapsed into a small ravine. "That's got to be it." They approached cautiously, weapons ready, prepared for anything. But when they reached the line shack, they found it empty. No sign of Lena. No sign of Isabel. Just an old building slowly being reclaimed by the desert. "They were here," Sullivan said, pointing to fresh tracks in the dust around the building. "Multiple horses. Recent, maybe a few hours ago." Ethan felt ice form in his stomach. "Drake found them." "Or Lena got spooked and moved," Rodriguez suggested, though he didn't sound convinced. Carter was studying the tracks more carefully. "Drag marks here. Someone was pulled onto a horse, not mounting willingly. And look, blood on the doorframe." The evidence told a story none of them wanted to hear. Drake's men had found the hiding place. There had been a struggle, and Lena and Isabel had been taken. "We go to Drake's ranch," Ethan said, his voice cold. "We end this. Tonight." "That's suicide," Rodriguez protested. "Drake will have dozens of men. We're 5 exhausted fighters with barely any ammunition left." "I don't care. I'm done running. I'm done failing." Ethan met each of their eyes. "I'm going to Drake's ranch. I'm going to find those women, and I'm going to burn that place to the ground. Anyone who wants to walk away, I understand, but I'm done." For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Carter checked his rifle and nodded. "Hell with it. I'm in." "Same," Sullivan added. Rodriguez sighed heavily. "You're all insane, but I'm not letting you die without me." He looked at Marcus and Thomas. "You two should go. This isn't your fight anymore." But Marcus shook his head. "We came this far. We finish it." As the sun began its descent, 6 exhausted men rode toward Drake's ranch with nothing left to lose. They had no plan beyond reaching the ranch, no strategy beyond desperation. But sometimes desperation was enough. Sometimes it had to be. The ranch looked different in the fading light, less like a prosperous estate and more like what it truly was, a fortress built on blood and corruption. Guard posts dotted the perimeter and armed men patrolled in organized shifts. Getting inside undetected would be nearly impossible. Getting inside at all might be suicide. Ethan and the others watched from a ridge about half a mile out, studying the layout and trying to find any weakness they could exploit. The main house blazed with lamplight, and even from this distance they could hear sounds of activity. Men shouting orders, horses being moved, wagons being loaded. "Something's happening," Rodriguez observed. "They're mobilizing for something." "Probably Cowboy clearing out," Carter said. "Drake knows the assassination succeeded. He's probably getting ready to disappear before anyone connects him to it." "Which means he'll take Isabel and Lena with him," Sullivan added quietly. "If they're still alive." The unspoken alternative hung heavy in the air. Drake had a reputation for eliminating problems permanently. 2 women who knew too much about his operation would be loose ends he couldn't afford to leave behind. "We need to move now," Ethan said. before they finish whatever they're preparing and leave. Move how? Rodriguez asked. We can't fight our way through that many guards, and we can't sneak past them all. Marcus, who'd been silent for most of the ride, spoke up suddenly. What if we don't fight or sneak? What if we walk right in? Everyone turned to look at him. Think about it, Marcus continued. They're mobilizing, moving supplies, lots of activity. Everyone's focused on their tasks. If we looked like we belonged there, if we acted like ranch hands or hired men, we might be able to blend in long enough to find the women. That's insane, Carter said, but his tone suggested he was considering it anyway. It's all insane at this point, Rodriguez muttered, but it might actually work. We're dirty enough from the trail to pass for workers, and in all that chaos, faces might not get checked too carefully. Ethan studied the ranch again with new eyes. Marcus was right. The activity created cover. Everyone would be too busy with their own tasks to pay close attention to a few more dusty workers moving through the compound. We need to split up once we're inside, Ethan said, the plan forming as he spoke. 2 of us search for Isabel and Lena. The others create a distraction, start a fire in one of the outbuildings, spook the horses, anything that pulls attention away from the main house. I'll search with you, Rodriguez said to Ethan. I know the layout of that house from our last visit. The cellar where Drake likes to keep people is accessible from the kitchen. Thomas and I can handle the distraction, Marcus offered. We worked stables before Drake's ranch. We know how to make horses panic. Carter nodded. Sullivan and I will provide cover. We'll position ourselves where we can see the main approaches and watch for trouble. It wasn't much of a plan. It relied on luck, timing, and the chaos of the ranch's activity to mask their presence. But it was something, and something was all they had left. They rode down from the ridge as twilight deepened into full darkness, approaching the ranch from the south, where the activity seemed heaviest. As they got closer, Ethan could make out individual figures moving between buildings. Men loading crates onto wagons, guards changing shifts, workers tending to dozens of small tasks. At the southern gate, a bored-looking guard stopped them with a raised hand. Who are you? New hires, Rodriguez said smoothly. Came in from Redemption Creek. Drake sent word he needed extra hands for the move. The guard squinted at them in the lamplight. Nobody told me about new hires. Nobody tells you anything, Rodriguez shot back with just the right amount of tired irritation. They told us to report to the stable master. You want to walk us over there, or can we find it ourselves? The guard hesitated, clearly weighing the effort of checking their story against the effort of just letting them through. In the end, laziness won. Stables are that way. Don't cause trouble. They were in. The compound was even more chaotic up close. Men shouted orders that contradicted each other. Wagons rolled past loaded with everything from furniture to ammunition crates, and the air smelled of dust, sweat, and horse manure. Perfect conditions for 6 desperate men to disappear into the machinery of Drake's operation. Marcus Thomas, head for the stables, Ethan said quietly. Give us 15 minutes, then start your distraction. Carter, Sullivan, find high ground with sightlines to the main house, Rodriguez added. If we come out running, we'll need covering fire. The group split up, each pair melting into the organized chaos. Ethan and Rodriguez made their way toward the main house, moving with purpose like they belonged there. They passed groups of workers without drawing a second glance, just 2 more hired hands in a place full of them. The kitchen entrance at the back of the house was unguarded. The focus was on the front gates and the perimeter, not on servants' access points. Rodriguez tried the door. It opened silently. Inside, the kitchen was empty, but showed signs of recent use. Dishes in the sink, a pot still warm on the stove. Voices drifted from deeper in the house, muffled by walls and distance. Cellar entrance is through there, Rodriguez whispered, pointing to a narrow door near the pantry. They moved quickly and quietly. The door opened onto steep wooden stairs descending into darkness. Rodriguez pulled out a match and struck it, the brief flare of light revealing a stone-walled passage below. The cellar smelled of earth and dampness, and something else. Fear and suffering, the residue of pain absorbed into the walls over time. As they descended, Ethan could make out shapes in the dim light, storage crates, wine racks, and at the far end, a heavy wooden door with a bar across it. Rodriguez extinguished the match as they approached the door. Ethan lifted the bar as quietly as possible and pulled the door open. Inside the small cell, two figures huddled in the corner. Lena's head snapped up, her eyes wide with fear that transformed to desperate hope when she recognized them. "Ethan," she whispered. "You came." Isabel was beside her, barely conscious. Even in the dim light, Ethan could see fresh bruises on her face and arms. She'd been beaten badly, and recently. "Can she walk?" Ethan asked as he and Rodriguez entered the cell. "I don't know. Drake's men worked her over pretty thoroughly when they caught us at the line shack." Lena's voice cracked. "They killed the guard I'd bribed to help us escape. Then they brought us back here, and Drake—" She couldn't finish the sentence. Rodriguez gently lifted Isabel to her feet. The young woman's eyes opened briefly, unfocused and glazed with pain. "It's okay," Rodriguez said softly. "We're getting you out of here." "Can you walk?" Ethan asked Lena. "I can run if I have to, but Isabel—" "I'll carry her," Rodriguez said, adjusting his grip to support Isabel's weight. "You just stay close and stay quiet." They made it back up the cellar stairs without incident, but as they emerged into the kitchen, the door to the main house opened and a servant entered carrying a tray of empty glasses. The servant froze. His eyes went from the strangers to the battered woman Rodriguez was carrying, and his mouth opened to shout. Ethan moved fast, closing the distance and clamping a hand over the servant's mouth before he could make a sound. "Don't," Ethan said quietly. "We're not here to hurt you. We're just leaving. Understand?" The servant nodded frantically, eyes wide with terror. "Good. Now you're going to sit down in that corner and stay quiet for 5 minutes. Can you do that?" Another nod. Ethan released him and the servant scrambled to the corner, clearly wanting no part of whatever was happening. They'd just turned toward the outside door when voices echoed from the hallway, multiple men, coming closer. "Kitchen should be stocked for the journey," one voice said. It was Drake. "I want everything loaded onto the lead wagon within the hour." "Yes, sir," another voice replied. "And the women in the cellar?" "Leave them. We're burning this place before we go anyway. They'll die in the fire, along with any other evidence." The casual way Drake discussed murder sent rage flooding through Ethan. But there was no time for confrontation. They had to get out before Drake and his men entered the kitchen. Rodriguez jerked his head toward the cellar stairs. It was the only option. They couldn't go out the back door without being seen, and they couldn't fight their way through Drake's men while carrying an injured woman. They retreated back down into the cellar just as the kitchen door opened. Above them, Drake's voice continued giving orders. "And check on our guests one more time before we seal them in. I want to make sure they understand what happens to people who cross me." Footsteps crossed the kitchen floor, heading directly for the cellar door. Ethan and Rodriguez exchanged a glance. They were trapped. If Drake's men came down those stairs, there would be a fight in close quarters with Isabel caught in the crossfire. But then, from outside came the sound of panicked whinnying and men shouting in alarm. Marcus and Thomas had started their distraction. "What in hell?" Drake's voice sharpened. "Check that out. Now!" The footsteps reversed direction, moving away from the cellar and toward the back door. Within seconds, the kitchen was empty again except for the terrified servant still huddled in his corner. "Move!" Rodriguez hissed. They burst from the cellar and through the kitchen, the servant pressing himself against the wall to let them pass. Outside, chaos had erupted across the compound. The stable was burning, flames leaping high into the night sky, and horses were stampeding in every direction. Men ran everywhere trying to control the animals and fight the fire simultaneously. Perfect chaos. Ethan led the way, weaving between running figures and panicked horses. Nobody paid them any attention. Everyone was too focused on the immediate crisis. They were halfway across the compound when a voice cut through the confusion. "Stop them!" Ethan looked back and saw Drake standing on the porch of the main house, pointing directly at them. Beside him stood one of his guards, rifle already coming up to aim. "Run!" Ethan shouted. The rifle cracked and the bullet whined past, too close. They sprinted toward the southern gate where they'd entered, Rodriguez somehow managing to carry Isabel while running. More shots rang out behind them, and Ethan heard the distinctive boom of Carter's rifle answering from somewhere in the darkness, covering fire. The guard at the southern gate was distracted by the burning stable and didn't see them coming until they were right on top of him. Rodriguez shifted Isabel's weight and kicked the man in the chest, sending him sprawling. They burst through the gate and into the open ground beyond. Their horses were where they'd left them, hidden in a wash about 200 yards from the ranch. The distance seemed infinite as they ran across open ground with bullets kicking up dust around them. Ethan's lungs burned and his legs felt like lead, but he kept moving. Sullivan appeared from the darkness, providing covering fire with rapid, precise shots that forced Drake's men to take cover. Carter was right behind him, his face grim and determined. They reached the horses and Ethan practically threw Lena into a saddle before mounting his own horse. Rodriguez handed Isabel up to Marcus, who cradled the injured woman carefully as he mounted. Within seconds, they were riding hard into the darkness, leaving the burning stable and Drake's curses behind them. But the pursuit came quickly. Drake wasn't the type to let them escape. Within minutes, Ethan could hear hoofbeats behind them. At least a dozen riders, maybe more. "They're gaining!" Sullivan shouted. "Head for the canyon country," Rodriguez called back. "If we can reach the arroyos, we can lose them in the terrain." They rode like demons were chasing them, and maybe they were. The horses were already exhausted from days of hard travel, but they gave everything they had left. Behind them, the pursuit grew closer, and occasional gunshots cracked through the night. The ground grew rougher as they entered the broken country northeast of Drake's ranch. Deep cuts in the earth opened up without warning, forcing them to slow and pick their route carefully, even as their pursuers closed the distance. Ethan's horse stumbled on loose rock, but recovered, its breathing labored and desperate. They couldn't keep this pace much longer. The animals were on the verge of collapse. "There," Rodriguez pointed to a narrow canyon mouth ahead. "We can make a stand in there." They plunged into the canyon, the walls rising steeply on either side. It was a risk. If Drake's men bottled them up in here, they'd be trapped. But they were out of better options. The canyon opened into a small box canyon with a flat floor and sheer walls. It was a natural dead end, which meant it was defensible from one direction. They dismounted quickly, taking positions behind rocks and using the exhausted horses as additional cover. Drake's men appeared at the canyon mouth moments later, a dark mass of riders silhouetted against the starlit sky. They reined in their horses when they saw the narrow entrance, smart enough to recognize a potential ambush. For several long seconds, neither side moved. Then a rider walked his horse forward into the mouth of the canyon, and Ethan recognized Leonard Drake himself, somehow managing to look composed even after chasing them across miles of desert. "Mr. Rourke," Drake called out, his voice echoing between the stone walls. "You've been remarkably persistent. I respect that, even if it's ultimately futile." "Let us go," Ethan shouted back. "You've already won. The generals are dead. The war continues. You got what you wanted." "Not quite. What I wanted was a clean operation with no loose ends. Instead, I have 2 escaped prisoners and several witnesses who know too much about my business affairs." Drake's silhouette shifted as he gestured to the canyon walls. "You've trapped yourselves in a dead end. Surrender now, and I'll make your deaths quick. Keep fighting, and it will be considerably less pleasant." "We have evidence," Ethan replied. "Documents detailing your entire conspiracy. If we don't make it out of here, others will find them and expose everything. Evidence is only useful if someone believes it, and I think you'll find that my influence extends further than you imagine." Drake's voice hardened. "Last chance, Mr. Rourke. Come out with your hands up." Ethan looked at the others. Rodriguez was checking his ammunition, down to maybe 6 rounds. Carter and Sullivan were in similar shape. They could hold the canyon entrance for a while, but they couldn't win. Not against the numbers Drake commanded. Isabel stirred in Marcus's arms, her eyes opening fully for the first time. When she spoke, her voice was weak but clear. "Don't surrender. He'll kill us all anyway. At least this way we choose how we die." "Nobody's dying," Ethan said, though he wasn't sure he believed it. "Then you'd better have a miracle ready," Rodriguez muttered, "because we're about 30 seconds from a slaughter." But before Drake could give the order to attack, new sounds echoed through the night. Many horses, approaching fast from the direction of Drake's ranch. Drake turned in his saddle, clearly surprised. A large group of riders appeared behind Drake's men, and even in the darkness, Ethan could make out military uniforms. At their head rode a man who carried himself with unmistakable authority. An officer, and a high-ranking one based on his bearing. "Leonard Drake!" The officer's voice rang out with command. You're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, fraud, and treason against the United States. Drake's composure cracked for the first time. What is this? Who are you? Major General William Hendricks, United States Army. We received intelligence about your operations from Fort Harrison. Seems some documents detailing your conspiracy made it to the right hands after all. The general gestured and soldiers moved forward, surrounding Drake's men. Order your men to disarm, now! Drake's men looked to their employer, hands hovering near weapons. For a terrible moment, Ethan thought Drake would order them to fight. But the man was a businessman first, and he recognized when the odds were insurmountable. Stand down, Drake said coldly. The soldiers moved in quickly, disarming Drake's men and placing them under guard. General Hendricks rode to the canyon entrance, his eyes finding Ethan. You're Rourke? The one who tried to warn Fort Harrison about the attack. I am, sir. You have the documents you mentioned? The evidence of Drake's conspiracy? Ethan pulled out the papers Lena had stolen, now crumpled and stained from everything they'd been through. Right here, sir. The general took them and scanned quickly, his expression growing darker with each page. This is exactly what we needed. When you tried to warn Colonel Matthews at the fort, he didn't believe you, but after the attack he remembered what you'd said and sent word to headquarters. We've been investigating Drake's operation for the past 18 hours. He looked at Drake with cold fury. We found evidence of weapons trafficking, bribery of military officials, and conspiracy with enemy agents. Combined with these documents, we have enough to hang you 10 times over. Drake's face was a mask of controlled rage, but he said nothing. What about Victor Hale? Ethan asked. He's the one who actually carried out the attack. Hale and his surviving men are already in custody at Fort Harrison. They'll hang for the murders of General Ashford and General Kincaid. The general's voice was hard. Both sides of this war have been manipulated by profiteers and conspirators for too long. We're going to make examples of everyone involved. Soldiers helped Isabel and Lena onto horses and provided medical attention. Ethan watched as Drake was led away in chains, the man's empire crumbling around him. All his wealth, all his influence, all his careful planning, reduced to nothing by documents stolen by a brave woman and the determination of a few desperate people who refused to let evil triumph. As the soldiers prepared to escort them all back toward Fort Harrison, Rodriguez moved to stand beside Ethan. We did it, the Mexican said quietly. Against all odds, we actually did it. We stopped Drake, Ethan corrected. But we didn't save the generals. We didn't prevent the assassination. No, but we exposed the conspiracy behind it. We made sure the people responsible will face justice. Rodriguez put a hand on Ethan's shoulder. Sometimes that's all you can do. Make sure the guilty pay for their crimes. You wanted redemption, Rourke. I'd say you found it. Ethan wasn't sure he agreed. Redemption seemed too grand a word for what they'd accomplished. They'd stumbled through disaster after disaster, failed to prevent the very thing they'd set out to stop, and only succeeded in the end because of luck and the determination of people braver than themselves. But Isabel was alive. Lena was free. Drake would hang for his crimes, and somewhere in the wreckage of the conspiracy, maybe a few lives had been saved that otherwise would have been lost. Maybe that was enough. As they rode back toward Fort Harrison with a military escort, the eastern sky began to lighten with the first hints of dawn. It had been nearly a week since Ethan had ridden into Redemption Creek with nothing but worthless money and broken dreams. In that time, he'd become a fugitive, infiltrated a gang of killers, witnessed the depths of human corruption, and somehow emerged on the other side with something like honor intact. The frontier had a way of testing people, burning away everything false until only the essential truth of a person remained. Ethan had been tested and found wanting in some ways. He hadn't prevented the tragedy at Fort Harrison, but he'd also found reserves of courage and determination he hadn't known he possessed. As the sun broke over the horizon, painting the desert in shades of gold and amber, Ethan allowed himself to feel something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. The war would continue, at least for now. The generals who'd wanted peace were dead, and their loss would echo for months or years to come. But the conspiracy to perpetuate the conflict for profit had been exposed. Drake's network would be dismantled. Other profiteers would think twice before trying similar schemes. It wasn't the victory Ethan had hoped for, but it was a victory nonetheless. When they reached Fort Harrison, they found the base still in recovery from the attack. The burned command building had been partially cleared, and workers were already beginning repairs. Soldiers moved with the grim determination of men who'd survived tragedy and refused to be broken by it. General Hendricks took personal custody of the documents and arranged for Ethan and the others to give full statements about everything they'd witnessed. The process took hours, multiple officers asking the same questions in different ways, trying to build an ironclad case against Drake and his co-conspirators. Through it all, Isabel and Lena were cared for in the fort's medical facility. The doctor reported that while Isabel's injuries were severe, she would recover fully with time and rest. Lena had stayed by her sister's side, holding her hand and whispering reassurances. It was late afternoon when Ethan finally finished giving his statement. He found Rodriguez sitting outside the medical building, smoking a cigarette and watching the sun descend toward the western horizon. "They're going to let us go," Rodriguez said without preamble. "The general says we're heroes, not criminals. Even you, the sheriff in Redemption Creek, will be informed that you're cleared of any wrongdoing in James Holloway's death." "That's good," Ethan said, though he felt oddly empty. For days he'd been driven by the need to stop the conspiracy, to save Isabel, to find redemption for the shooting that had started everything. Now that it was over, he wasn't sure what came next. "What will you do?" Rodriguez asked. "Go back to cattle driving?" "Maybe. Or maybe I'll try to find that piece of land I wanted. Start over somewhere quiet." Ethan sat down beside the Mexican. "What about you?" Rodriguez was quiet for a long moment. "I don't know. I've spent so long just surviving, just getting through each day, that I'm not sure what living for something actually looks like anymore." He took a long drag on his cigarette. "But maybe it's time to find out." Carter and Sullivan appeared from around the building, both looking cleaner than Ethan had seen them in days. "General wants to see us all together," Carter said. "Says he's got news." They gathered in the general's temporary office, a tent set up near the command building ruins. General Hendricks stood behind a field desk covered in maps and reports, his expression serious but not unkind. "Gentlemen, I wanted to thank you personally for what you've done. Your actions may not have prevented the attack on Fort Harrison, but they've exposed a conspiracy that reached far higher than Leonard Drake. We've arrested 3 congressmen, 2 military suppliers, and half a dozen bureaucrats who were all part of Drake's network." He paused. "The president himself has been briefed on the situation. He's ordered a full investigation into war profiteering across all military contracts." "Will it make a difference?" Ethan asked. "I hope so. But corruption is like weeds. You can pull it up, but it grows back if you're not vigilant." The general picked up a document from his desk. "As a token of appreciation, the United States government is offering each of you a reward. The amount is substantial, enough to buy land, start a business, begin a new life." He handed Ethan an official-looking paper with a dollar amount that made his eyes widen. It was more money than he'd ever imagined having, converted to proper Union currency that would actually hold its value. "This is too much," Ethan said. "It's barely adequate given what you've sacrificed and risked." The general's voice was firm. "Take it. Use it to build something good. The frontier needs more men like you, men willing to stand up for what's right, even when it's dangerous." One by one, the others received their reward papers. Marcus and Thomas looked stunned. Carter actually smiled for the first time since Ethan had met him. Sullivan's hand shook as he held the paper that represented a future he'd never dared hope for. "There's one more thing," the general said. "The women you rescued, Lena and Isabel Garrett, they've asked to speak with you, Mr. Rourke, if you're willing." Ethan found the sisters in a small recovery room in the medical building. Isabel lay in a clean bed with white bandages covering her worst injuries, but her eyes were alert and clear. Lena sat beside her, holding her hand. "You came for us," Isabel said as Ethan entered. Her voice was still weak, but there was strength underneath. "Even after everything went wrong at Fort Harrison, you came back." "I couldn't leave you with Drake," Ethan replied simply. "Most men would have. Most men would have said saving 2 women wasn't worth the risk." Lena's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "You gave us our lives back, Mr. Rourke. That's a debt we can never fully repay. You don't owe me anything. You're the one who stole the documents that exposed Drake. You're the one who had the courage to run." Ethan pulled up a chair and sat down. What will you do now? Where will you go? The sisters exchanged a glance, some wordless communication passing between them. We've been talking about that, Lena said. We have family back east in Pennsylvania, people who might take us in while we figure out what comes next. The general's giving us travel money, Isabel added. Enough to get there and start over, away from the frontier, away from… She didn't finish, but she didn't have to. Away from the memories of what Drake had done to her. I think that's good, Ethan said. The East is safer, more civilized. You'll be able to build a real life there. What about you? Lena asked. Where will you go? Ethan thought about the reward money in his pocket, about the cleared charges in Redemption Creek, about the wide-open frontier that stretched in every direction. He thought about the dream he'd carried for 3 years, a piece of land, a fresh start, a life built on something other than survival. I'm going to find some land, he said, somewhere quiet, with good water and decent soil. I'm going to build a cabin and raise some cattle and try to live a life that doesn't involve running or fighting or watching people die. That sounds lonely, Isabel said softly. Maybe. But after everything that's happened, lonely sounds pretty good. They talked for a while longer, sharing stories and making plans. When Ethan finally stood to leave, both sisters rose carefully and embraced him. It was an awkward, emotional moment that none of them quite knew how to navigate, but it felt important somehow, a recognition of the bond forged through shared trauma and survival. As Ethan walked back across the fort, he ran into Victor Hale. The former cavalry captain was being led between buildings under heavy guard, his hands and feet shackled. Despite his captivity, Hale walked with his head high, defiant to the end. His eyes found Ethan and held them. Rourke, Hale said, and the guards paused. I heard you're the one who exposed Drake's conspiracy. I helped, Ethan replied carefully. You know the attack still succeeded, right? The generals are still dead, the peace talks are still ruined. All you did was make sure some rich man hangs for it. Hale's voice carried bitter amusement. Do you feel like a hero? No, Ethan said honestly. I feel like someone who tried to stop something terrible and mostly failed. But at least I tried. What's your excuse? Hale's expression hardened. I'm a soldier. I follow orders and complete missions. That's what soldiers do. You're a mercenary who sold out to a profiteer. That's what you are. Ethan stepped closer, lowering his voice so only Hale could hear. You talk about Cedar Creek, about how the war destroyed your faith in the cause. I understand that. But you know what you did? You let that destruction turn you into exactly the kind of monster who creates more Cedar Creeks. You became what you hated. For just a moment, something flickered in Hale's eyes. Recognition, maybe, or regret. But then it was gone, replaced by cold defiance. We're all monsters, Rourke. Some of us just pretend better than others. Hale nodded to the guards. I'm done here. They led him away, and Ethan watched him go with a strange mixture of pity and contempt. Hale was right about one thing. They were all shaped by the violence they'd witnessed and committed. The difference was in what you chose to do with that shaping. Hale had let it make him cruel. Ethan was trying, desperately, to let it make him something better. Whether he'd succeed remained to be seen. The next morning, Ethan and the others prepared to leave Fort Harrison. The general had arranged for fresh horses and supplies and had given them each a letter of commendation that would serve as proof of their service should they ever need it. Rodriguez was heading south, back toward Mexico, and family he hadn't seen in years. Carter and Sullivan were going west together, planning to buy into a mining operation in the territories. Marcus and Thomas would escort Lena and Isabel east, making sure they reached Pennsylvania safely, which left Ethan alone, exactly as he'd planned. They said their goodbyes in the early morning light. These men who'd been strangers a week ago and were now bound together by everything they'd survived. There were handshakes and backslaps and promises to meet again someday that everyone knew probably wouldn't be kept. But there was also genuine respect, hard-earned through blood and sacrifice. You're a good man, Rourke, Rodriguez said as they shook hands a final time. Don't let the frontier make you forget that. Same to you, Ethan replied. And then they were riding in different directions, 6 people scattering back to their individual lives, carrying with them the weight of what they'd witnessed and the hope of what they might still become. Ethan rode north toward the high country where he'd heard there was good land available for those willing to work it. The reward money in his saddlebag represented possibility, the chance to finally build the life he'd been dreaming about for 3 years. As he rode, the events of the past week played through his mind like a story someone else had lived. The shooting in Redemption Creek that had started everything, infiltrating Hale's company, the horror of Drake's ranch and the courage of 2 sisters who refused to be broken, the desperate race to Fort Harrison and the failure to prevent disaster, and finally, the confrontation in the Box Canyon where everything had come to a head. He'd set out to clear his name and start fresh. Along the way, he'd become part of something larger, a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of power, a struggle between those who profited from war and those who yearned for peace. He hadn't won. Not really. The generals were still dead. The war would continue. People would keep suffering while others grew rich from their pain. But he'd fought back. He'd refused to accept that evil should triumph unchallenged. And in the process, he'd saved 2 lives and helped dismantle a network of corruption. Maybe Rodriguez was right. Maybe that was redemption enough. The frontier stretched ahead of him, vast and unforgiving and full of possibility. Somewhere out there was a piece of land with his name on it. Somewhere out there was a future that didn't involve running or fighting or counting worthless currency with broken dreams. Somewhere out there was peace, if he was willing to ride far enough to find it. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, Ethan Rourke believed that maybe, just maybe, he deserved to find it. The high country welcomed Ethan with cold winds and endless sky. He rode for 3 days through terrain that grew progressively more beautiful and unforgiving. Granite peaks dusted with early snow, valleys carpeted in tall grass that waved like ocean swells, rivers so clear you could count stones on the bottom from horseback. It was land that had seen few settlers, too remote and harsh for most people's taste. But to Ethan, it looked like exactly what he needed: space to breathe, distance from the corruption and violence that had defined the past week, room to build something that belonged only to him. On the 4th day, he found it. The valley opened up without warning, a broad stretch of flatland nestled between protective ridges. A creek ran through the center, fed by snowmelt from the peaks above, and cottonwood trees clustered along its banks. The grass was thick and green, perfect for grazing. And at the northern end, a natural shelf of rock would provide foundation for a cabin and shelter from winter winds. Ethan sat on his horse for a long time, just looking. He'd imagined this moment for 3 years, finding the perfect piece of land, the place where he could finally stop running and start living. Now that it was real, the emotion that washed over him was almost overwhelming. He dismounted and walked the valley on foot, testing the soil, checking the water flow, examining sight lines and drainage. Every practical bone in his body told him this was good land, maybe the best he'd ever seen. It would be hard work, building a cabin, clearing fields, establishing a herd, but it would be his work, for his future. As the sun began to set, painting the valley in shades of gold and amber, Ethan made camp near the creek. He built a small fire and cooked the last of the supplies he'd bought at a trading post 2 days back. The meal was simple, beans and hardtack and coffee so strong it could strip paint, but it tasted like victory. He was still eating when he heard the sound of approaching horses. His hand went instinctively to his gun, but he forced himself to relax. If someone meant him harm, they wouldn't announce themselves so obviously. 2 riders emerged from the tree line, silhouetted against the dying light. As they drew closer, Ethan recognized them with a shock of surprise. Rodriguez and Lena. "Thought you were heading south," Ethan called out as they dismounted. "And you were supposed to be going east." Rodriguez shrugged, his familiar half-smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Got as far as the border and realized I had nothing waiting for me there. Families scattered, and Mexico feels like someone else's life now." He looked around the valley appreciatively. "Heard through the grapevine that you were heading to high country. Figured I'd see if you needed a hand building whatever you're planning to build." Lena's explanation was simpler and more complicated at the same time. "Isabel's on her way east with Marcus and Thomas. She needs to get far from the frontier, somewhere she can heal without constant reminders. But I realized something on the road. I've spent my whole life being afraid, being controlled by men like Drake, running from one bad situation to another. She met Ethan's eyes directly. I'm tired of running. I want to build something instead, and I thought maybe you could use help with that. Ethan should have been annoyed at the intrusion into his solitude, the disruption of his carefully imagined future. But looking at these two people who'd fought alongside him, who'd proven themselves when everything fell apart, he felt only relief. I could use the help, he admitted. This valley's got enough space for 3 people to make claims. Maybe more, if others come looking. Others already did, Rodriguez said. Carter and Sullivan are about half a day behind us. They got to the mining territories and decided it wasn't for them. Heard we were heading this direction and figured they'd tag along. So much for my quiet solitude, Ethan said, but he was smiling. They spent the evening around the fire, talking about plans for the valley. Rodriguez had experience with construction from his time in the army. Lena knew about farming and animal husbandry from her years working various ranches. Between them and Ethan's trail experience, they had enough knowledge to make a real go of it. Carter and Sullivan arrived the next afternoon, along with an unexpected addition, a young couple named Sarah and John Mitchell who'd been traveling west looking for affordable land. Carter had met them on the trail and mentioned the valley, and they'd followed along hoping for a chance. Within a week, what had been Ethan's private dream had transformed into something larger. A community of people who'd all been displaced by the war in one way or another, all looking for a fresh start in country remote enough that the past couldn't follow them. They drew up claims, registered them with the nearest territorial office 3 days' ride away, and began the backbreaking work of turning wilderness into homesteads. They built Ethan's cabin first, a solid structure of logs chinked with mud and topped with a shake roof. It wasn't fancy, but it was sturdy and weatherproof. Then Rodriguez's cabin, then Lena's, then structures for Carter and Sullivan who decided to partner up, and finally a small house for the Mitchells. Each building took weeks of hard labor, felling trees, trimming logs, fitting them together, raising walls and roofs that would stand against winter storms and summer heat. The work was exhausting and sometimes frustrating, but it was also honest. Every blister on Ethan's hands, every aching muscle, every dawn that found him already working, it all meant something. He was building a future instead of running from a past. News from the wider world reached them occasionally through travelers and traders. The war had indeed continued after the assassination at Fort Harrison, but something had shifted. The exposure of Drake's conspiracy had sparked investigations across military supply chains, rooting out profiteers and corrupt officials. The public outcry had been significant enough that politicians on both sides felt pressure to pursue peace more aggressively. 6 months after the attack, new generals had been appointed to continue the negotiations that Ashford and Kincaid had started. The talks were slow and difficult, but they were happening. Leonard Drake had been tried, convicted, and hanged for treason and murder. His execution had been public, attended by hundreds who wanted to see justice done to a man who'd profited from their suffering. Victor Hale and the surviving members of his company had met similar fates, though Hale had gone to the gallows with the same defiant pride he'd shown in life. Ethan felt no satisfaction in their deaths. Hanging Drake didn't bring back the generals or undo the conspiracy, but it did send a message that some crimes were too monstrous to go unpunished, and maybe that mattered. Sheriff Holloway in Redemption Creek had been formally notified that Ethan was cleared of any wrongdoing in his brother's death. The letter had included a terse apology for the manhunt and an offer to return any property that had been seized. Ethan had written back declining the property. He had no desire to return to Redemption Creek or to own anything that connected him to that place. The first winter in the valley tested them all. The snow came early and deep, burying the landscape in white silence for months. They survived by pooling resources, sharing food and firewood, and helping each other through the hardest days when temperatures dropped so low that stepping outside could kill you in minutes. It was during that winter, huddled around Rodriguez's fireplace, during a particularly brutal storm, that Lena first mentioned the idea. "We should name this place," she said, looking around at the faces lit by firelight. "If we're building a real community here, it should have a name, something that means something." "What did you have in mind?" Sarah Mitchell asked. "I don't know, something about new beginnings, maybe, or about leaving the past behind." Lena looked at Ethan. "You found this valley, What do you think it should be called? Ethan considered. He thought about everything that had led him here, the worthless money, the shooting in Redemption Creek, the conspiracy that had nearly destroyed what little hope for peace existed. He thought about Isabel's bruised face and Drake's cold eyes, and the moment in the box canyon when death had seemed certain. And he thought about the sunrise the morning after they'd escaped, the way the light had broken over the desert like a promise. New Dawn, he said finally. This valley, this community, we'll call it New Dawn, because that's what we're all getting here, a chance to start fresh. The name stuck. By spring, when the snow melted and revealed the valley again, traders and travelers had begun referring to it as the New Dawn Settlement. A few more families arrived, drawn by word of available land and a community built on mutual support rather than exploitation. They built a communal barn for shared equipment and a meeting house that doubled as a school when enough children arrived. They dug irrigation ditches to expand the arable land and built corrals for the cattle and horses that were slowly being accumulated. Ethan bought his first herd in late spring, 30 head of decent cattle purchased from a rancher who was retiring. It wasn't the 50 head he'd originally dreamed of, but it was a start. Rodriguez and Carter went in together on another 20 head, and they combined their herds for easier management. Lena proved to be invaluable, her knowledge of animal husbandry and farming far exceeding what anyone else in the settlement possessed. She taught the others about crop rotation, about reading weather signs, about the 100 small details that made the difference between success and failure in frontier agriculture. She and Ethan developed a partnership that surprised them both. They worked side by side most days, building fences or tending animals or planning next season's planting. The partnership was comfortable, built on mutual respect and shared experience rather than romance or passion. But something was growing there nonetheless, something neither of them quite knew how to name. It was Rodriguez who finally pointed it out, sitting with Ethan one evening while watching the sunset paint the valley in impossible colors. "You love her," Rodriguez said bluntly. "What?" "Lena. You love her. Anyone with eyes can see it." Ethan started to deny it, then stopped. Because Rodriguez was right. Somewhere between building cabins and surviving winter and working toward a shared future, his feelings had shifted from respect to something deeper. "I don't know if she feels the same way," Ethan said quietly. "Then you're blind as well as stubborn. The woman looks at you like you hung the moon." Rodriguez took a drink from his canteen. "Question is, what are you going to do about it?" "I don't know. Everything's complicated enough without adding..." "Adding what? Happiness? Connection? Something to live for beyond just surviving?" Rodriguez shook his head. "You've spent 3 years working toward a dream of land and fresh starts. You've got the land. Now maybe it's time for the rest of the dream." The words stayed with Ethan through the following weeks. He found himself watching Lena more carefully, seeing the way she smiled when she thought no one was looking, the strength in her hands as she worked, the kindness she showed to everyone in the settlement. She was beautiful, but more than that, she was good. She'd survived terrible things and refused to let them make her cruel or bitter. She'd chosen to build instead of destroy, to hope instead of despair, and she deserved better than a man too scared to tell her how he felt. It was midsummer, with the valley at its most beautiful, when Ethan finally found the courage. They were working together to repair a section of fence that had been damaged by a fallen tree, and the work had put them far from the main settlement. "Lena," Ethan said as they took a break in the shade, "can I ask you something?" "Of course. Do you ever regret coming here? Staying on the frontier instead of going east with your sister?" Lena was quiet for a moment, considering. "I miss Isabel. I worry about her. But regret? No, this is where I'm supposed to be." She looked at him directly. "Why do you ask?" "Because I need to know if you plan to stay. If you see a future here." "I do. This place, these people, it's the first real home I've had since I was a child." She paused. "But I think you're really asking something else. So why don't you just ask it?" Ethan felt his heart hammering. He'd faced down gunfighters and conspirators and impossible odds, but this moment terrified him more than any of that. "I'm asking if you see a future that includes me, not just as a neighbor or a friend, but as..." He struggled for the right words. "As someone you might want to build a life with." Lena's expression softened. I've been waiting for you to ask that for months. And? And yes, you fool. Of course, yes. She closed the distance between them and kissed him, and it felt like coming home after a long journey through hostile territory. They were married in the fall, with the whole settlement in attendance. There was no proper minister, the nearest church was 3 days' ride away, so they wrote their own vows and had Rodriguez, as the settlement's unofficial leader, officiate. It was simple and heartfelt and perfect. Sarah Mitchell cried during the ceremony. Carter and Sullivan presented them with a hand-carved wooden table they'd been secretly building for weeks. And as Ethan and Lena stood together looking out at the community they'd helped build, surrounded by people who'd become family, he felt a completeness he'd never experienced before. This was what he'd been searching for all along, though he hadn't known it, not just land or money or security, but connection, purpose, a place in the world where he mattered and was valued. The settlement continued to grow. By the second winter, they had 15 families, a proper school with a teacher who'd come west from Boston, and a general store run by a retired Army quartermaster. They'd established trade relationships with neighboring settlements and were beginning to develop a reputation for quality cattle and crops. News of the war reached them less frequently now, filtered through layers of distance and time. But the news that did arrive suggested the conflict was finally winding down. The peace negotiations had succeeded, producing a framework for reunification that both sides could accept. The formal surrender came in early spring of their second year in the valley, and the news was met with quiet relief rather than celebration. Too many had died. Too much had been destroyed. The war's end was necessary, but not triumphant. A wound finally stopped bleeding rather than a victory to celebrate. Ethan and Lena received a letter that spring from Isabel. She'd settled in Pennsylvania with distant family and was working as a teacher in a small school. The wounds Drake had inflicted were healing, though she wrote that some scars would never fully disappear. But she was building a life, finding purpose in helping children learn, and she sounded happy in a careful, hard-won way. "She's going to be all right," Lena said after reading the letter aloud. "She's stronger than she knows." "She learned from the best," Ethan replied, pulling his wife close. They stood on the porch of their cabin, watching the sun set over their valley. The cattle were settling for the evening, their lowing carrying across the distance. Smoke rose from chimneys throughout the settlement as families prepared dinner. Children played in the last light of day, their laughter bright and clear. It was an ordinary evening in an ordinary place, and it was everything Ethan had ever wanted. "Do you think about it much?" Lena asked quietly. "Everything that happened before we came here?" "Sometimes. Less as time passes." Ethan thought about Drake and Hale, about the generals who died at Fort Harrison, about the conspiracy that had nearly succeeded. "I used to think redemption meant erasing the past, making up for the bad things by doing enough good things to balance the scales. But I don't think it works that way." "How does it work?" "I think you just do the best you can with what you have. You make choices that align with who you want to be, and you live with the consequences of the choices you made before you knew better." He gestured to the valley spread before them. "This place, this life, it doesn't erase anything, but it's proof that we survived, that we didn't let the worst things we experienced define us forever." Lena leaned her head against his shoulder. "I used to pray that someone would save me. Every day at Drake's ranch, I prayed for rescue. And then you came, and you did save me. But the thing I didn't understand then was that you also gave me the tools to save myself, to build a life where I didn't need saving anymore." "We saved each other," Ethan said simply. "That's what people do, if they're lucky." As darkness fell and stars began to emerge in the vast sky above, they went inside to their home. The cabin was modest but comfortable, filled with small touches that made it theirs. Books on a shelf Ethan had built, quilts Lena had sewn, photographs from a traveling photographer who'd passed through the previous summer. There was a letter on the table that Ethan had received the day before but hadn't opened yet. It bore the seal of the United States Department of War. With Lena watching curiously, he broke the seal and read. The letter was from General Hendricks. It informed him that the full investigation into war profiteering had concluded, resulting in dozens of arrests and the recovery of millions of dollars in fraudulent contracts. The work that Ethan and his companions had started by exposing Drake's conspiracy had grown into something much larger, helping to clean up corruption that had plagued the war effort for years. The general wrote that, while the assassination at Fort Harrison had been a tragedy, the exposure of the conspiracy behind it had ultimately accelerated the peace process. Politicians who'd been secretly prolonging the war for profit had been removed from power. Military officers who'd been accepting bribes had been court-martialed. The government that emerged from the war was cleaner, more accountable, and more committed to genuine reconstruction. Your actions, though they couldn't prevent the immediate tragedy, helped create the conditions for a lasting peace, the general wrote. History will not record your names alongside the great generals and politicians, but know that your contribution to ending the war and building a better nation was significant and will echo for generations. Ethan set the letter down, feeling emotions he couldn't quite name. They'd failed to save the generals. They'd failed to prevent the attack. But in failing, they'd exposed something larger and more dangerous than a simple assassination plot. They'd helped dismantle a system of corruption that had fed on war and suffering. Maybe that was enough. Maybe that was more than enough. "We did good," Lena said, reading over his shoulder. "We did something that mattered." "We did," Ethan agreed. That night, lying in bed with his wife beside him and the sounds of the valley filtering through the windows, wind in the cottonwoods, the creek flowing endlessly, the distant call of a nightbird, Ethan thought about the journey that had brought him here. He'd started as a man with nothing, his life savings turned to worthless paper, his dreams seemingly destroyed. He'd killed a man in self-defense and become a fugitive. He'd infiltrated a gang of killers and witnessed the depths of human corruption. He'd failed to prevent an assassination that changed the course of history. But he'd also found courage he didn't know he possessed. He'd made allies who became friends, who became family. He'd saved lives and exposed evil and helped build something good from the wreckage of war. And he'd found this, a valley called New Dawn, a community built on hope, a woman who loved him, and a future that stretched ahead with possibility instead of fear. The frontier wind carried away the last echoes of gunfire and conspiracy, replacing them with the sounds of construction and growth, of children learning and cattle grazing and people building lives worth living. Summer turned to fall, and fall to winter, and winter back to spring. The settlement grew and prospered. More families arrived, drawn by the promise of good land and honest community. They built a church and a proper schoolhouse, expanded the general store, and established a rotating watch system for mutual protection. Rodriguez surprised everyone by falling in love with a widow named Maria, who arrived with 3 children and a wagon full of determination. They married in the spring and built a house large enough for their blended family, and Rodriguez proved to be a natural father to children who desperately needed one. Carter and Sullivan started a blacksmith business that quickly became essential to the settlement's operations. The Mitchells had their first child, a daughter they named Hope, and the sound of a baby's cry in the valley felt like a blessing on everything they were building. And Ethan and Lena worked their land, tended their growing herd, and built a life that was ordinary and extraordinary all at once. They had struggles, cattle that got sick, crops that failed, winters that tested their endurance. But they faced each challenge together, supported by a community that had learned the hard way that survival depended on cooperation. On a warm evening in their 3rd year in the valley, Ethan stood on the ridge overlooking the settlement and took stock of everything they'd accomplished. Where there had been wilderness, there were now farms and ranches. Where there had been silence, there was the sound of voices and laughter and life. The valley had been transformed, and so had he. He was no longer running from anything. The charges in Redemption Creek were long forgotten. The conspiracy he'd helped expose had been dismantled. The war that had shaped so much of his life was over, fading into history and memory. He was simply Ethan Rourke, rancher and husband and member of a community that depended on him as much as he depended on it. It was a quiet identity, unremarkable to anyone who hadn't known where he'd come from or what he'd survived. But to Ethan, it was everything. Lena joined him on the ridge, slipping her hand into his. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. "How far we've come. How different everything is from what I imagined when I first rode into Redemption Creek with worthless money in my pocket. Is it better or worse than you imagined?" Ethan considered the question seriously. "It's different. I thought I just wanted land and solitude. Turns out what I really needed was purpose and connection. He looked at his wife. I needed you. Good answer, Lena said with a smile. Then her expression grew more serious. I have something to tell you. Something in her tone made Ethan's heart skip. What is it? I'm pregnant. We're going to have a child. The words seemed to hang in the evening air, full of weight and possibility. A child. New life born from everything they'd survived, everything they'd built. Ethan pulled Lena close, feeling the full measure of joy and terror that came with the news. Are you sure? I'm sure. Sarah helped me confirm it this morning. Lena's hand went to her stomach. In about 6 months, there's going to be one more person in this valley. One more reason to keep building, keep hoping. They stood together on the ridge as the sun painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson, watching their community settle in for the evening. Somewhere below, Rodriguez was teaching his stepchildren to fish in the creek. Carter was closing up the blacksmith shop while Sullivan banked the forge. The Mitchells were calling their daughter in from play. Ordinary moments in an ordinary place made extraordinary by the journey it had taken to reach them. The child was born in early spring, a boy they named Thomas after Lena's father who'd died in the war. He was healthy and loud and perfect, and holding him for the first time, Ethan felt something shift in his understanding of the world. This was what they'd all been fighting for, even when they didn't know it, not just land or money or victory, but the chance for new life to enter a world that was slightly better, slightly more just than the one that had come before. The settlement celebrated Thomas's birth with a gathering that lasted well into the night. There was food and music and stories, and for a few hours, the hardships of frontier life faded into the background, replaced by simple joy. As the celebration wound down and people drifted back to their homes, Rodriguez pulled Ethan aside. You did good, my friend. Built something worth protecting, worth passing on. We all did, Ethan replied. This isn't just my accomplishment, it's all of ours. True enough. But you were the one who had the courage to try, even when everything seemed hopeless. That matters. Rodriguez clasped Ethan's shoulder. The frontier's changing. More settlements, more laws, more civilization creeping in. In a few years, this place might not even feel like the frontier anymore. But what we built here, this community, these relationships, that'll last regardless of what else changes. The words proved prophetic. Over the following years, the frontier did change. The war's end brought waves of settlers west, seeking new opportunities in territories that had been too dangerous during the conflict. Territorial governments became more organized, law enforcement more consistent, infrastructure more developed. New dawn grew, along with the changing frontier. They got a proper sheriff appointed from the territorial capital, a man named William Bass who'd served honorably during the war and wanted nothing more than a quiet life keeping the peace. They built a telegraph office that connected them to the wider world. A doctor settled in the valley, and then a lawyer, and then a newspaper editor who started publishing a weekly paper documenting their community's growth. But through all the changes, the core of what they'd built remained. A community of people who'd survived terrible things and chosen to build something good from the wreckage. They looked out for each other, helped each other through hard times, and celebrated each other's successes. Ethan's herd grew to over 200 head, making him one of the more prosperous ranchers in the territory. But prosperity didn't change the basic rhythms of his life. The early mornings checking cattle, the afternoons mending fences or moving irrigation, the evenings spent with Lena and Thomas watching the sun set over their valley. Isabel visited once, bringing with her the man she'd married, a schoolteacher named David who was kind and patient and clearly adored her. The sisters spent hours talking and crying and laughing, healing old wounds through shared presence. Thank you, Isabel said to Ethan before she left, for saving me, for giving Lena a chance at this life, for caring when you didn't have to. You don't need to thank me, Ethan replied. You both saved yourselves. I just helped a little. Years passed, marked by seasons and harvests and the steady accumulation of ordinary days that added up to a life. Thomas grew into a bright, curious boy who loved the valley and the cattle and the endless sky. Lena gave birth to 2 more children, a daughter named Isabel after her sister, and another son they called James, reclaiming the name from the tragedy that had started everything. The children grew up hearing stories of the war and the conspiracy and the desperate fight to expose corruption. But the stories seemed distant to them, like tales from another world. Their world was one of community gatherings and school lessons and playing in the creek, of safety and stability that their parents had fought so hard to create. Ethan watched his children grow and marveled at the life he'd somehow managed to build. The dreams he'd carried for 3 years on the cattle trail had been small, just land and a fresh start. But what he'd found was so much larger: love and family and purpose, connection and community and legacy. The valley called New Dawn became his true home, more completely than anywhere he'd lived before. It held his past and his present and his future all intertwined. A place where the man he'd been and the man he'd become could finally coexist in peace. On quiet evenings, sitting on his porch with Lena beside him and their children playing in the yard, Ethan sometimes thought about the journey that had brought him here. He thought about the shooting in Redemption Creek, about Victor Hale's ice-cold eyes, about Drake's casual cruelty and the generals who died trying to make peace. He thought about Rodriguez and Carter and Sullivan, about Marcus and Thomas, and all the people who'd helped along the way. Most had scattered to other parts of the frontier, building their own lives. But they stayed connected through occasional letters that brought news of marriages and children and small triumphs. And he thought about the choice he'd made in that saloon all those years ago, to fight back instead of surrender, to stand up against injustice even when the odds were impossible, to believe that one person's actions could matter. He hadn't saved the generals. He hadn't prevented the war from continuing. But he'd helped expose a conspiracy that would have made things worse. He'd saved lives that would have otherwise been lost. And he'd built something good and lasting in a place that had been empty wilderness. Maybe that was the real definition of redemption, not erasing the past or balancing some cosmic scale, but simply refusing to let the worst things you'd experienced or done define you forever. It was choosing, day after day, to build instead of destroy, to hope instead of despair, to believe that tomorrow could be better than today. The frontier wind still blew through the valley, carrying with it the scents of grass and cattle and clean water. But now it also carried the sounds of a thriving community, children's laughter, and the ring of the blacksmith's hammer and the bell from the schoolhouse marking the end of lessons. The echoes of gunfire and war had faded, replaced by the sounds of life being lived fully and deliberately. And in those sounds, Ethan found the peace he'd been searching for since before he even knew he needed it. Years turned into decades. The children grew and had children of their own. The settlement became a proper town with elected officials and organized services. The frontier continued to change, becoming less wild and more settled with each passing season. But through it all, Ethan and Lena remained at the center of the community they'd helped build, elder voices of wisdom and experience. They taught their grandchildren about hard work and integrity, about standing up for what was right even when it was difficult, about the importance of community and connection. And when people asked them about the old days, about the war and the conspiracy and the dramatic events that had shaped their lives, they told the truth simply and without embellishment. It was history, important to remember but not glorify. The violence had been real, the stakes had been high, but the true victory hadn't been in the fighting. It had been in everything that came after, the building and growing and healing that turned an empty valley into a home and a collection of strangers into a family. On a warm autumn evening in his 68th year, Ethan stood on the same ridge where he'd stood so many times before, looking out over the valley that bore the name New Dawn. The sun was setting, as it had thousands of times since he'd first arrived, painting the sky in impossible colors. Lena stood beside him, her hair now silver, her hands work-worn but still strong. Their children and grandchildren were gathered at the house below, preparing for a celebration of Ethan's birthday. "Do you have any regrets?" Lena asked quietly, echoing the same question she'd asked so many years before. Ethan thought about it honestly. He thought about the generals who'd died, about the people he hadn't been able to save, about the failures and mistakes that still sometimes haunted his dreams. But then he looked at the valley spread before him, at the town that had grown from wilderness, at the community that thrived on mutual support, at the legacy of goodness and determination that would outlive him by generations. "No," he said finally. "I don't regret any of it. The hard parts made the good parts possible. The failures taught us how to succeed. The darkness we survived makes the light we built mean something. That's a good answer, Lena said, exactly as she had all those years ago. They stood together on the ridge, two people who'd survived impossible odds and built something beautiful from the wreckage of war and corruption. The frontier wind blew through the valley one more time, carrying with it the promise of tomorrow and the peace of a day well lived. And somewhere in that wind, if you listened carefully, you could hear the echo of what New Dawn had always represented: hope renewed, chances taken, and the enduring belief that even in the darkest times, human beings could choose to build instead of destroy. The sun dipped below the horizon, leaving the sky ablaze with color, and as night fell gently over the valley called New Dawn, Ethan Rourke looked across his land and realized something rare and precious. Peace had finally come, not just to the valley, not just to the country still healing from war, but to the heart of a man who'd traveled far and sacrificed much to find it. And it was enough, more than enough. It was everything.